Chapter 24, 24th Link. Haku had never seen Naruto so focused before, not in this way. He always had an intensity about him, yes, but it was an emotional thing. He turned his fury into a blade, transformed irritation into amusing revenge, and squeezed every last drop he could out of his brief excitements. On the battlefield though, he was wild and uncontrolled. His chains always felt like separate living entities that went along with the blonde's whims because they found them just as amusing as he did. That Naruto was gone. For months he had thrown himself into rigorous training like she had never seen. He barely even took missions anymore, save for the ones Jiraiya managed to drag him along on. Ever since that strange conversation they shared, he had seemed unsatisfied. He no longer looked at his chains as beautiful instruments of slaughter, but as the chakra constructs, the tools they were supposed to be. They were even more dangerous for it. He was dueling Nezumi. Haku had met Naruto's sensei/teammates, he referred to them interchangeably, and it was a suitably complex relationship to match, and found them likable enough. Saru especially seemed happy to give her little pointers, even sharing what he knew of the Yuki clan before they had been wiped out in the bloodline purges. It wasn't much, he had only met them in conflict after all, but it gave her a few ideas for some new techniques. Teiko she could have done without, but after dealing with Jiraiya's antics, the man's perversion seemed tame in comparison. Kuma on the other hand, was a delight. She found his childlike innocence refreshing. She supposed, coupled with his ability to discuss killing like a toddler might talk about breaking his toys, she should have found him disturbing. But ignoring him would have been like neglecting a child. Plus, he always complimented her ice, calling it pretty, or sparkly. Her father had found it abhorrent. Zabuza had thought it useful. The demon brothers said that it was an unfair advantage. Naruto only ever said it had made her a pain to catch, although, that was a compliment from him in its own way. She had never had somebody simply like it. Nezumi on the other hand, she didn't know what to think of the woman. She was reserved, but not reticent. She was undoubtedly beautiful, but Naruto's relationship with her was more like a particularly unruly younger brother. Haku wasn't even sure the woman realized how attractive she was, with her lithe, buxom figure. Naruto certainly wasn't paying it any heed as he mercilessly moved forward. His footwork was like that of a swordsman, although he held no blade. Instead, his chains rose up around him in curved arcs, like a sideways insect. Before, they had always held an animalistic quality, swaying about as though alive. Now they resembled fearsome weapons, poised to strike. They still swayed, but not with wasteful, intimidating movements. They were simply accounting for the possible gaps in the blonde's guard. Fighting Naruto had always been a scary notion. Now though, it looked downright terrifying. He had even changed his appearance to match, ditching the mismatched outfit he had pulled together all those months ago. Now he wore a utilitarian gray vest over his fishnet shirt, and his collarless jounin jacket over that, still left open of course. She could see the ANBU influences in the outfit, but it was softened, tempered, not as rigid. It wasn't a uniform, it was a choice. Nezumi stepped in, sword flashing forward so fast it left a silvery trail across Haku's vision. Naruto stepped into the movement, three of his chains lashing forward in perfect synchronization. The first slapped the flat of the woman's blade, normally not enough to divert a strike as strong as Nezumi's, but the second struck a fraction of a second later. Like two wavelengths constructively interfering, the strength of the blow was exponentially increased and Nezumi was forced to spin the attack into a sweeping strike at the teen's base. He stepped back, a chain whipping back to anchor him so he didn't lose balance. It snapped taut, launching him forward into a brutal kick that Nezumi just about got her blade in front of. Haku had been on the receiving end of one of those, she was surprised the blade didn't snap. Like a jellyfish closing its fronds, the rest of Naruto's chains collapsed inwards, brought forward by the sudden halt to his momentum. He forced them to spin as they shot forward, each of them turning into its own miniature drill. Nezumi let her blade fall to the side, focusing with her usual blank intensity to move between the chains. Each one came close enough to slice her clothes, but not one touched her skin. Naruto drew his own blade as she moved into his guard and suddenly they were a flurry of movement, slicing, blocking and parrying so fast that the clinks of their swords seemed out of sync with their actual movements. Naruto curled his chains inwards to strike at her back, and his sensei responded by lengthening the arcs of her blade. It made her a hair slower, but it meant that with one swing she could parry Naruto from the front and deflect a chain at the back, repeating ad nauseum. It was the most beautiful display of swordsmanship Haku had ever seen. When she had asked Saru why Nezumi had never taken a student before now, she had been surprised to learn that she had indeed tried. Apparently, the poor guy was now perpetually ill and terrified of mice. Nezumi sped up her footwork, forcing Naruto to turn with her or leave his side exposed. It meant his chains trailed slightly, having to move in a much wider circle than Nezumi did. It eased the attack from Nezumi's rear and the woman pressed her advantage, keeping the blonde on the back foot. Not too long ago, Naruto would have snarled and increased the aggression of his assault. Now though, he looked the perfect image of Nezumi's student. His face remained mostly impassive as two of his chains returned to wind up his arms. Suddenly, Nezumi wasn't having such success in forcing him back. Blows he normally would have parried he blocked, others he would have blocked he countered. It was almost imperceptible, but Haku had eyes used to high-speed movement. With each flex of his arms, the chains would coil or relax, adding a little burst of strength to his movements. It was something she imagined took unbelievable amounts of focus, but in a few short months Naruto had managed to refine his new technique, bastardized from his own observations of Tsunade's strength, into an action as natural as breathing. Suddenly in the strange position of being the weaker in a kenjutsu match, Nezumi flipped backwards. She landed on one hand, using the longer reach of her legs to catch the two chains Naruto sent after her between her toes. She abruptly did the splits upside down, pulling the chains apart and Naruto forward slightly. While he was briefly off balance, she threw out a handful of shuriken with her free hand. She did all of this in one smooth motion, never once looking like she was improvising. Haku was almost disappointed when most of the shuriken flew wide. She was surprised then when Nezumi pushed off her hand, completing the flip, and launched out another handful of the weapons. Naruto's chains were busy deflecting those that would have been on target, they ignored those that soared past him. That was a mistake. The second volley had been thrown much harder, catching up to the first and deflecting off their companions. Naruto hissed as 5 shuriken embedded in his back, at a completely impossible angle. A moment later and his wince turned into a smile. Haku knew why. From what he had told her, Nezumi rarely used ranged weaponry, preferring her sword or other melee weapons. That he had forced her even that far was a good sign. She suddenly felt apprehensive, and for good reason. The unmistakable feeling of the Kyuubi's chakra began to weigh on the clearing. It felt as though warm molasses was being poured over her body and her mouth went dry. It was like standing in the dunes of Kaze no Kuni. Immediately, his wounds fizzled and steamed as the shuriken were forced out. The small gashes on his back healed rapidly, not even leaving scars. He had told her that some kind of god had removed the Kyuubi's will from his power. She wasn't sure what to think about that. He had certainly become more comfortable with its use, occasionally bringing it out during their training. Likewise, his chains no longer became the mottled, ugly things they did under the beast's influence. The blades on the end became sharper and serrated, but otherwise remained the golden constructs she had come to know. Despite that, whenever he used the Biju's chakra he became more aggressive. It was still him, and according to his own testimony he still had his faculties and awareness. But he tended to be crueler, more vicious, choosing options that would inflict maximum pain instead of damage. The Kyuubi's chakra was a potent thing that required a steel will and enormous hatred to use. Even if it was still Naruto under that burning cloak of energy, using that power brought out the worst in him. Or, perhaps more accurately, he poured the worst of himself into it. "Alright, I think we can call it there," Saru called from the sidelines. Haku was thankful for the respite as, a few moments later, Naruto restrained himself and let go of the chakra cloak. "It was just getting interesting," Naruto complained half-heartedly, already sheathing his sword. "Training yourself to exhaustion is not always the best way forward," Saru lectured easily. "Dedication has its place, but alongside moderation and temperance." Naruto rolled his eyes, he had probably heard the same speech 100 times before. When he was in a talkative mood, he was particularly fond of recounting some of his exploits in ANBU. Technically, he wasn't supposed to say anything about his time there to outsiders. Haku couldn't say she didn't feel privileged that he ignored that rule for her. Although in Naruto's case, it may have just been his usual disregard for, in his opinion, trivial regulations. Nezumi just shrugged, throwing a thumbs up Naruto's way. "Nice fight." The slight smile he gained might have surprised Haku not too long ago, especially seeing it up close as he walked towards her. "How about a few rounds? You said you had a new technique you were curious about?" She couldn't help smiling. She had told him that during one of their nightly chats, almost in passing. She was surprised he even remembered. A technique for reducing targeted inflammation in the brain, not a combat technique. He clicked his teeth. "Still." She shook her head. "Sorry, Lady Tsunade requested I return to the hospital after lunch. I followed you here because I thought it would be nice to get some reading done." She hefted the scroll in her hand slightly, although she couldn't say her attention had been very focused on it while Naruto was sparring. It had absolutely nothing to do with his vest being undone, revealing the mesh armor he wore underneath. Nope. Thankfully, he ignored her reddening cheeks, latching onto something else. She's got you calling her that as well now? Haku shrugged. Despite your personal problems with her, Lady Tsunade is an incredible doctor. I've learned more than I could have imagined from her, even in such a short time. In truth, she suspected Shizune shared her opinion, found Naruto and Tsunade's little feud amusing. Perhaps it was their immature appearances, contrasting their respective abilities, that highlighted just how childish it all was. Maybe it was just that both could be surprisingly inventive in causing the other increasing consternation. By now though, there was no real enmity in it. Naruto wasn't the type to hold a grudge, despite appearances, and Tsunade had forgiven him a while ago. They just enjoyed winding each other up. Whatever. She was still working on getting him to admit that he and the older blonde were basically friends by now. He looked up thoughtfully for a second as she packed up her things. All right, maybe it's about time I took a mission. Haku smiled, breathing an internal sigh of relief. That meant no training tonight, good. Naruto may be all for these months of intensive self-improvement, but her stamina was not nearly as limitless as his. She hoped that meant this whole episode was winding down. Still, try to enjoy yourself. There were 3 of them, huddled around the mutilated corpse of a young deer. They were little more than animals really, slaves to their baser instincts. They had been hungry and angry, so they killed something for food. Naruto watched them from his vantage on a nearby branch, chakra suppressed as low as he could manage. He could still feel it though, brimming beneath the surface, eager to be released and used. Ever since gaining greater control over the Kyuubi's chakra, it had grown more difficult to ignore. It was always there, ready to be used at a moment's notice. Patient. Waiting. He had greater control over his own energy than any other time in his life, but the desire was still there, simmering. The temptation to abandon all of his training and pull on that limitless well until everything in front of him was destroyed. The Kyuubi may have gone quiet, but that simply meant the demons of his own creation were that much louder. 2 whole tails. That was how great his control had grown. 7 tails of the mightiest Biju's power at his disposal. Beyond that, he just couldn't pull any more. It was like his body was a sieve, and those last, elusive grains of power were too small for his body to hold on to. So, he trained, body and mind, until he could close those last few gaps and truly master that chakra. He filtered a tiny bit towards his nose, enhancing his smell until it was more akin to a wolf's than a human's. The creatures were alone, he would be able to smell if there were any more in the vicinity. They had a foul, corrupted sort of scent. It was as if somebody had taken tree sap and pissed on it. Orochimaru's curse seal. They were ugly and malformed, their skin various mottled shades of dark gray. These were the rejects, the 40-odd% that didn't die, but also didn't truly survive the procedure. Their minds were gone, but they were still a pain to put down. That wasn't Naruto's job though. These things had been causing trouble all throughout the area recently, killing livestock and the occasional unlucky traveler. He was here to find out where they were coming from. Then he would put them down. He put 2 fingers on his throat, pinching slightly as he let out a low, rumbling growl. It was one of Nozumi's tricks to mimic other people or creatures. He chose a mountain lion. They weren't even remotely indigenous to this region, but the curse seal rejects didn't care, they only heard a potential predator. He laced a little of the Kyuubi's chakra into the growl, making it much louder than it should have been. It also added a near imperceptible weight to the noise, the kind that animals were much better at detecting than humans. That was enough for the instinct-driven creatures below him, and they immediately scattered. He quickly created clones to follow the other 2 and made after the third, keeping to the trees. Occasionally he would repeat his ventriloquist's trick to spur the thing on, and after nearly 20 minutes of pursuit it bore fruit. Seeking some place familiar against the threat of danger, the creature led him to what looked like a waste disposal pipe jutting out from a rocky overhang. It was covered by vines and earthy detritus, but the rusty metal set it apart from the undergrowth. Naruto ended the creature's misery with a negligent flick of a chain. A blade through the upper spine, instant, painless. He didn't even play about with it. Saru would be proud. Unfamiliar memories popped into his head of 2 similar executions elsewhere in the woods as his clones dispersed themselves. 3 less of the things to worry about. That done, he stalked into the pipe, once again suppressing his chakra. Orochimaru's bases were rather uninspired, Naruto couldn't help but think. Once you had seen one, you'd seen them all. Narrow, twisting passageways done in chevron paneling, any of which could be a trap just waiting to be depressed, with the occasional inlet in the wall for a candle. He walked along the ceiling instead, it was just packed earth and there was a simple Doton jutsu he could use to determine if there were any hidden surprises. There weren't. This seemed to be a somewhat run-of-the-mill research station. The snake Sannin had dozens like it scattered all over the elemental nations. Some he had created himself, others were converted from old bunkers used during the various shinobi wars, thus the rather utilitarian design. At first glance, this one appeared to be abandoned. Curseal abominations certainly roamed the halls freely. At the same time, there were signs of recent, intelligent habitation if one knew where to look. For one thing, the long-lasting chakra candles were only about an eighth melted. They would have been replaced just yesterday, and the attacks had been going on for at least a week. Somebody was purposefully releasing the creatures. Some kind of experiment. It was a bit lazy to be Orochimaru's handiwork, but he had a lot of lieutenants that were given more autonomy than most of his underlings. The candles were his guide. He followed the ones that were the most used up, those would have been replaced first and would be closer to wherever this person lived. It led him to a large, open chamber with a raised gallery surrounding a sunken, earthen pit. Training ground or gladiatorial arena, the uniformity to the gouges littering the walls made him lean towards the former. He was getting closer then. Something else caught his eye, a slight glitter that pervaded the various scratches. A thin layer of shimmering, crystalline dust. It was pink. Naruto grinned and turned towards the only other door in the room, an exultant feeling growing in his chest as he stalked forward. This was perfect. This was exactly what he needed. A test. To see how far he had come, to see how far she had gone. The door opened before he reached it. A lithe young man with prematurely gray hair that Naruto vaguely recognized emerged, carrying a loose sheaf of papers. His large, round spectacles glinted in the flickering candlelight as he glanced up, surprised to find somebody else in the room. Ah, I had wondered when the rejects might draw official notice. I have to say, your response was faster than I prayed dash. Whatever he had to say was cut off as a golden chain speared through his throat without mercy, flying across the room faster than the older teen could blink. Out of the way 4 eyes, Naruto growled, still grinning with anticipation even as the chain continued to curl around the lackey's throat. It viciously threw him to the side and snapped his neck in a clean, conservative motion. He was probably dead before he hit the wall. Not here for you. He raced through the complex, again following the subtle hints that implied more regular habitation until he burst into another large chamber, this one better resembling a rough-hewn operating theater. It was complete with a brightly lit, sunken stage surrounded by amphitheatrical tiered seating. One of the Curseal abominations lay strapped to an operating table, dead. Guren had been standing to one side, eyeing the creature with disgust. When Naruto walked in she turned with a sneer. That was fast, Kabuto. What, couldn't wait to fail again. I swear you grow more incompetent with. She trailed off when she realized she wasn't talking to her intended subject of derision, instead pulling herself into a guarded stance. You. Naruto simply grinned. Me. I'd hoped we would never run into each other again. Naruto pouted. It was far from an endearing expression. That hurts. I've been looking forward to our rematch. It's currently 1-0 to you, and I'd hate to leave the score so unbalanced. The woman scowled, crystal blades appearing on her arms. It was faster than he remembered. Good, that meant she had gotten stronger. What makes you think this'll end any differently? The blonde crouched, grinning as chains snaked down his legs. Let's find out. He sprung forward, the chains uncoiling violently to propel him across the room in a yellow streak. Guren barely got her arms up in time. She tried to slash him in half, but Naruto had twisted in midair, using the blades of the chains resting just under his feet like ice skates. The two weapons screeched against one another, but the chains held. Guren's surprise was nothing against Naruto's elation. The moment he realized Guren could no longer cut his chains with ease, he kicked out, spinning himself in the air. Chains swirled around him, perfectly level with one another in a deadly disc. The first struck Guren on her side, impacting harmlessly on her crystal armor. Then the second struck the exact same spot and she gasped. The third hit, and the armor cracked. The last hit and the flexible crystal around her ribs shattered completely, propelling her across the room in an ungraceful arc. She found her feet, but Naruto was already sprinting towards her, movements aided by coiled chains around his limbs. Each one flexed and tightened in time with the pumps of his arms and legs, adding just that little extra spurt of power that added up. His prior assumption about her use of her technique's names as a focus tool seemed confirmed when she rotated her arms around her, calling up the crystal wheel she had been fond of in their last fight without saying a word. The initial surprise of Naruto's boost in abilities appeared to have passed and her eyes were set in concentration. They widened a little when Naruto didn't break off from his charge, despite the imminent bisection. Instead, at the last second, he dived over her jutsu, landing in a crouch behind her wheel. Two chains trailed behind him, abruptly flexing inwards to curl around the inside of her technique. She desperately tried to sharpen the interior, but it was too late. The chains picked her up, wheel and all, and threw her across the room like a discus. She was disoriented only for a moment, allowing her wheel to disperse so that she could hit the wall in a crouch. She slapped her hands down the moment she landed, letting crystal spread from her touch. The newly pink wall erupted with 10-foot-long spikes just as Naruto was diving towards her. He would have been impaled if he hadn't left a chain trailing behind him like a tail. It bit into the floor and stopped his forward momentum. The brief moment he was jerked forward, slightly off-kilter, she threw as many hexagonal shuriken as she could conjure. They flew forward in a flurry of deadly pink snowflakes. She smirked. From how fast he had shown being able to move his chains, he wouldn't have time to curl them back to defend. He surprised her by drawing a thin ninjato from his back instead, using it to deflect or outright block any of the shuriken that would have hit him. Guren tensed warily. The blonde berserker she had fought before would have just tanked those. Naruto flipped back, clicking his teeth as he looked at the blade. His chains might have been able to stand up to Guren's crystal now, but normal metal was another story. It was nicked and scratched to hell, the tip shorn clean off. "Nozumi's going to be pissed at me," he muttered, before discarding it. It was just dead weight now. He cracked his neck, observing Guren. She was still stuck to the wall, surrounded by her crystalline spires. He was certain that, with just a thought, she could command them into whatever shape she wished. It really was a marvelous ability, tough, versatile, beautiful. "My sensei keeps telling me there's a place for subtlety and tact," he noted idly, beginning to draw on that burning well of energy within him. "I guess that means there's also a place." Chains began to slink out of his body by the dozen, over 100 of them coiling and swaying in the air in a great, synchronized mass, for overwhelming force. They moved as one, driving towards Guren's crystal forest like a golden avalanche. She threw her hands forward and the crystal grew like a living being. The spires lengthened, thickened, extended in every direction in an enormous spiky shield. The bijou-enhanced chain slammed into it, and kept going. The tinkling of falling shards filled the room as the chains drilled forward, cracking and smashing through the shimmering pink shield faster than Guren could create more. There were too many of them. When one slowed, another took its place. Naruto stood at the heart of it, the eye in a storm of gold, watching the pink dust cloud that expanded slowly from the destruction. Then something broke. Perhaps he had damaged the structure of the crystal too much, perhaps Guren's strength had simply given out. There was an ear-shattering crack before the entire crystal defense collapsed inwards. The wall of chains lurched forwards, suddenly unopposed. Guren was already moving, flying up out of the dust cloud. A few stray chains scratched at her armor, but that was all they could do, lacking the sheer force of the main group. She was shrouded in shimmering green energy, pure chakra. He had no idea what she had done, but it seemed to have completely revitalized her. Crystal release. She slammed her hands together, a diamond prism of perfectly translucent crystal growing around her, one of the points aimed directly at him, arrow of light. She placed her chakra-wreathed hands on the parallel points of the diamond and the entire prism erupted in light. Naruto was forced to dive out of the way as a beam of pure energy lanced out from the tip. It made a deep drone as it scored a deep trench out of the floor, instantly melting the rock. It tracked him, following a step behind him as he withdrew his sea of chains. He jinked madly, trying to throw the deadly beam off his trail. Guren's aim was unerring though. He burst into a cloud of smoke, 5 clones darting out of it a moment later in different directions. Guren was undeterred though, manipulating the shape of her prism until the beam was split into 5 slightly weaker streams. Naruto knew that he just had to hold out, scowling as 2 of his clones were caught. The technique was obviously putting enormous strain on the woman, and the prism was gradually dissolving from the back, weakening the beam. Another clone was destroyed, and the last apparently thought it was better than just dying as a distraction. It threw itself in front of the original's beam, puffing into smoke with a defiant grin. Naruto used the opportunity well, launching himself under the beam and sprinting back towards Guren. She desperately tried to adjust her aim, the white lance of light close on the blonde's heel. But it wasn't fast enough. Thin, almost delicate-looking chains snaked down his arm. His eyes had narrowed into slits from the concentration it took to do this. He was certain that without the Kyuubi's chakra providing enough power this would be impossible. They cross-crossed in a careful pattern down the length of his arm, down his back, across his legs. They curled around his fingers, almost making it look like he was wearing bright gold knuckle dusters. They coiled tighter, digging into his skin, drawing blood in places. He still hadn't completely mastered this, he just hoped it was enough. His strides grew longer, aided by the chains around his legs, they cracked the stone where his feet hit. Then, suddenly, Guren was in front of him, her shocked features clear through the near-invisible crystal. The blonde didn't hesitate, throwing his fist forward as the chains unfurled explosively as one. The crystal didn't even crack, his hand simply punched through as if it weren't there. The moment it connected there was an all-encompassing boom. He was nearly thrown back from the force of it, only kept in place by the anchoring chains across his legs and back. His fist continued on in the semi-completed technique he had devised to replicate Tsunade's strength. It hit Giran right in the chest, shattering her crystal armor as easily as glass. The woman had a single moment to look surprised, then she was gone. Naruto stopped, Giran flew. She crashed through the back of her own technique, flying uncontrollably, head over heels, until she smashed into the stone wall on the other side of the room. The second boom seemed to mingle with the first, leaving a drone that lingered even as the dust began to settle. Naruto staggered a moment before finding his balance. His arm fell limply at his side. He could already feel the Kyuubi's chakra begin to go to work fixing it up, but it would be useless for about a minute. He still hadn't gotten the timing perfect on that move. Still, a bright grin worked its way onto his face as he peered through the clearing dust. There was still a smattering of crystal powder in the air from where Giran's armor had shattered, and it made for an interesting sight. "Phew, how was that?" He called out to the room, bouncing on his feet a little. He felt exhilarated, the adrenaline coursing through him and leaving his head giddy. He stalked forward, trying to catch a glimpse of Giran. Slowly, her silhouette became visible and he tensed, wary for a counter. Gradually though, as the dust settled completely, he realized she wasn't moving. She lay there, slumped against the wall, propped up by the crater her body had made. His canine poked out of his lip. "Well, looks like that's tied the score up, huh?" His brow furrowed when he got no answer. "Unconscious? Seriously?" He stalked forward with a roll of his eyes. "You're going to have to up your game for the tiebreaker, this is a poor showing." When he reached her, he frowned, blinking slowly. She wasn't unconscious. The dust had hidden it, but her chest was almost entirely caved in. His eyes widened as he dropped to his knees, fingers going to her neck. Sure enough, no pulse. He pulled them back mechanically, face suddenly blank. He moved her so she was laying down, glancing about her body at the mortal wound he had caused. No. He didn't know any healing techniques, he hadn't even paid attention very hard when they went through basic first aid in ANBU. No. He slammed his freshly healed hand into the floor, caving in the stone and shaving off the skin on his knuckles. "Damn it. You weren't supposed to die. I wanted another round, I wanted to keep this going. You were fun. You were tough. You aren't supposed to die so easily." He gritted his teeth, eyes drawn to the back of his hand where, already, the skin was stitching itself back together. It was so easy for him, the Kyuubi's chakra ensured nothing but the most lethal of blows would take him down for good. It wasn't supposed to go like this. Other people were fragile. Kuma had said it so often that it had become background noise. He wondered how much the larger man even appreciated his own words. All of a sudden, Naruto couldn't get away from the thought. He glared down at the cooling corpse, as if he could make her apologize for dying too easily. But she just lay there. He picked himself up, knuckles fully healed, and walked away. He left Giran where she lay, she was dead, what did she care? Moving back through the underground compound with a scowl. He still had a job to do here, cleaning up the rest of the Curseal rejects. A while ago, the thought of such a hunt would have made his day. Now it just made him think of limp purple hair, splayed out in a pool of growing blood. As he was about to leave the room he glanced down, noticing a shard of pink crystal that must have broken off at some point. Without even understanding why, he stooped down to pick it up, staring at it a moment before slipping it into a pocket. It rested heavily against his leg as he moved through the compound. There was no joy in the slaughter, no thrill in the hunt. There was just death, and the dead. Chapter 25, 25th Link. Haku shifted back, making sure never to keep off the ground for too long. Naruto had superiority in the air, so she kept her footwork light but grounded. It was a dance, in her mind at least. The nature of her sparring partner's ability meant that she was forced to chain her movements into one seamless flow to avoid being hit. For once though, the incentive wasn't to avoid their sharp points. In fact, Naruto had actually blunted the tips of his weapons so all she would receive was the occasional bruise. She hadn't even known he could do that. It wasn't the only thing wrong with the training session. Naruto lacked his usual intensity. The chains moved slower, almost languidly. Far from his normal attitude, he didn't seem all that intent on pushing her. She was breezing through this exercise and he had barely ramped up the difficulty. In hindsight, it should have been a warning sign that she was noticing something off from her lack of injuries. It was that mission yesterday. Ever since he came back he seemed different. By virtue of his dislike of socializing, he often appeared thoughtful. Now though, she could actually tell that he was deep in thought about something, troubled even. She drifted back, like a leaf in the wind, and allowed a lazy flick of the chain to skim the front of her kimono. Naruto barely even seemed to notice. She began to subtly shift her positioning, ghosting forward in wide arcs that allowed her to continue dodging the lackluster swipes. She pivoted her foot, allowing the ground to take a blow aimed for her chest without losing ground. Then, suddenly, she was in front of him. Is something wrong? It was a credit to how far he had come that, when startled, Naruto simply took a step back instead of, as his teammates enjoyed putting it, going full hedgehog. He blinked, as if only realizing they were still training, before glancing over at where Haku should have been. You shouldn't have been able to get this close to me. The girl shrugged. You seemed distracted. The blonde seemed ready to argue, before thinking better of it and giving a half-hearted shrug of his own. I don't know. I suppose I was. Haku descended gracefully to the ground, patting the spot next to her. Something I could help with? He hesitated for a second before flopping down next to her, his chains catching him at the last moment and laying him down gently. Maybe. He seemed to chew on that thought for a moment before nodding. I want you to teach me how to heal. Haku blinked. That's not a decision to make lightly. Naruto scowled right back at her. Do I look like I make any decision lightly? His indignation ebbed away in the face of her soft smile. I didn't mean it that way, she placated. I'm merely curious about the sudden shift in priorities. For the last few months it had been nothing but getting stronger, faster, better able to kill. The sudden 180 seemed completely out of left field. There's no shift, he shot back tersely, but again he deflated when she continued to smile magnanimously. He frowned, looking down at his hand. A chain snaked out of his shoulder and coiled around the limb, the tip pointing back at him like an expectant snake. She hadn't seen him do that in quite some time, a remnant of his more theatrical days. I feel like I'm only good for killing. That's never bothered you before? She wasn't normally this blunt, but she knew nothing less would actually drag answers out of the stubborn teen. She was well used to his mannerisms after many such discussions late at night. Rarely were they so introspective though. No, it didn't, he admitted, almost reluctantly. It's just, recently. He paused, clearly struggling with how to continue. Haku lay a hand on his knee, noting that he only tensed for a moment. Something happened on your mission? He nodded. Somebody died that. I didn't want to. A client? He chuckled humorlessly, shaking his head. An enemy, actually. He released a drawn-out breath and leaned back, propping himself up with his hands to look up at the sky. I always used to think that fights were made sweeter by the life or death, that high-wire act between you and your opponent. I never realized the thrill that comes just from the exertion of it, from seeing your opponent counter you and really force you to struggle for the win. His smile was almost fond. She taught me that, the first time. This time I wanted to repay the favor, but... He glanced back down, his hand curling into a fist around the chain. I went too far. I didn't want to actually kill her, I think. The frown returned, and Haku felt something strange tighten in her chest as she heard him talk about this mystery woman. I suppose that's just stupid. She was an enemy, she had to die. I guess I just wanted to draw it out for as long as I could. The smile came back, but this time it was hollow. I never thought I could be too good at killing. He finally seemed to remember Haku was there, looking back up and wiping the emotion from his features. I want to know how to fix what I break. The gaze he met was filled with sadness though. I'm sorry Naruto, but you'll never be a medic. Before he could say anything, she held a hand up. It was an unusually forward gesture for her. This isn't something you can just train for. It's not a question of control, or effort, or determination. She laid a hand on his leg again. This time he was already tense. You're a Jinchuriki. Your chakra is simply toxic to other people. Any argument died on Naruto's tongue. He looked lost for a moment, as if struggling to articulate a point. He glanced away, then back at Haku with an indecipherable expression. Finally, he just sighed, turning his gaze back up to the sky. Haku wasn't sure she had ever heard Naruto sigh. I should have paid more attention to the first aid training in ANBU, he joked tiredly. Haku joined him in a weak smile. I'd be more than happy to help you with the more physical side of things. But I'll never be able to properly heal, like you or Tsunade? She shook her head, and he sighed again. She determined that she didn't like the sound when it came from him. So, all I'm good at is killing. His mouth twisted, as if he had tasted something particularly sour. At least it plays to my strengths? I didn't say that either, Haku said quietly, earning a bemused expression from the blonde. What else am I good for? He motioned with his hand and the chain unfurled, the dulled tip sharpening to a wicked edge. Haku looked at it fondly, shifting closer to the teen and reaching out to it. It swayed in the air a moment before coiling up her arm. It squeezed, and she knew it had enough power to snap her arm like a twig. But it didn't, the chakra construct simply rested against her skin, smooth like metal, but warm. You don't want to be a healer, she stated softly, still looking at the chain with a slight smile. Healers, while they have good intentions, are people that were too late. We take in the injured and fix them. Wouldn't it be better if they were never hurt at all? Medics don't have that power. She looked up and caught his eye. It was the most intense expression he had ever seen from her, but you do. She stroked the chain and watched it uncoil from her arm. You're strong, Naruto, but strength doesn't only have to be used selfishly. When you destroy an enemy, you also protect your allies. When you take a threat out of the world, you've prevented harm to somebody else. Seems like that would be a matter of perspective, he said, frowning. My enemy is somebody else's ally. She shrugged. He was almost surprised by the callous action. We don't live in a perfect world. She mirrored his humorless smile from earlier. In fact, we live in a very broken world, full of broken people trying to make uneven pieces fit. Zabuza-sama used to tell me that we're shinobi. It's a job like any other, just instead of building houses, or catching fish, we kill people. I never used to understand him, always feeling like such a job shouldn't have to exist. Her smile saddened. But just because I believe a job shouldn't exist, doesn't mean others will. As long as they exist. She shifted closer again, until their legs were touching and she was as close to him as she could be without pressing herself against his side. The world also needs people like you. I think the world would disagree with you. Most people think we need less killers. She shrugged again, and he could actually feel it from how close she was. There's a whole village of people over there that probably think the same way. People that tolerate the ninja because they allow them to live easy lives. They don't think for a second how many people had to die to ensure them that life, how many people you've had to kill. I've never given a thought to them when I kill. I did it for the fun. But you want to change? It wasn't a question, and Naruto could only nod slowly. Then it doesn't have to be for them. Or anyone else. It could be for one person, or a place, or an idea. If you let your killing mean something, then it isn't slaughter. It's protection. He still seemed troubled, but it had lessened slightly, enough that he was able to smile sardonically. I'm a bad influence on you, aren't I? The smile she gave him as she leaned in those last few inches could only be described as cheeky. The worst? Later, he would wonder why he didn't even think about leaning back as she moved to kiss him. In that moment though, all he could think about was the feeling of her lips. It was a clumsy, stilted thing, and it took him a moment to reciprocate. They were both inexperienced, and it showed when she flinched from his teeth knocking hers. But she didn't draw back, maintaining the intimate contact for another few seconds before drawing back with a smile. Why did you come to me and not Lady Tsunade? The question caught him off guard. His nose was still full of her scent. It was like the first hint of flowers after heavy snow. A moment later he caught up and smirked. I have my sensei. The answer would have been meaningless to anybody else, but Haku knew what he meant. She stood, feeling oddly weightless, and waited for him to follow her up. The moment he did, she ducked in for another kiss, this one shorter, but less toothy. Thank you. He collected himself much faster that time, waving her off with an absent chain. Never thought I would ever hear you say that. She shrugged. Neither did I. How did you go from wanting to kill me, to this? Like I said, I'm broken. And so are you. I guess our jagged edges just fit. He laughed at the absurd idea before a wicked gleam entered his eye. Speaking of broken. It occurs to me that I wasn't paying too much attention just now. I wouldn't have been taking it easy on you, would I? Haku gulped, but at the same time, couldn't fight back the slight heat that rose in her cheeks. Yeah, she was as broken as they came. But she was beginning to think that wasn't the worst thing in the world. Naruto grinned as he watched Haku walk out of the training ground with a well-hidden limp. Revelation about her feelings for him aside, he wasn't going to go easy on her. If anything, he would have to push her harder. He still wasn't completely sure how he felt about this. This kiss had been enjoyable. Clearly, something in his body knew the situation better than his mind. Likewise, he couldn't deny that he had come to enjoy Haku's company. Before his sensei, he hadn't thought he could confide in anybody. People were strangers to him, save for the glimmer of light that was the Hokage. But the old man ran a village and an army. He didn't have much time for a 7-year-old orphan, even if he was a Jinchuriki. Haku though, maybe it had been the fact she had been completely at his mercy. He had nothing to fear from her, so he had accepted her more easily than anybody in his life. Trust was a strange thing. A chain slid from his arm to coil and twist in front of his eyes. Since he began sleeping alongside Haku, he hadn't had a single flashback to his mother's life. He wasn't sure why, or what it meant, but he wanted it to continue. That slow, grinding loss of identity was one of his most pervasive fears. Haku was a bulwark. An admittedly attractive bulwark. He snorted, smiling bemusedly. He hadn't given a thought to the opposite sex his entire life, even with distractions like Nezumi and Anko, and suddenly he couldn't stop thinking about it. Puberty was even stranger. Young love's a funny thing, ain't it? Somebody mused to his left. Naruto whirled on a dime, chains whipping out of his body to cover his blind spots. If the intruder thought they would get a quippy remark from him, they were sorely mistaken. The intruder simply skipped out of range of his chains with a chuckle, giving Naruto time to give him a once-over. Obviously, the red clouds of the man's Akatsuki uniform caught his eye first, swiftly followed by the orange, spiraling mask that led into a single, darkened eye-hole on the right side. If possible, his body tensed even further. Ah, that's me, Naruto-kun. Attacking out of the blue like that. If you're here to kidnap me, you chose a bad place for it, Naruto snarled. This wasn't even one of the fringe training grounds. ANBU passed nearby here on their way back to the village all the time. Kidnap. The man threw his hands up like Naruto had said something scandalous. No way, I'm not here to kidnap you, silly. I wanted to talk. The blonde didn't relax for a second. And it's not like we're gonna be disturbed, the man announced happily. 'Cause I killed everyone in the nearby training grounds? He said it like a child informing their parents he had just made them a present. Definitely not one to relax around. And you are? Naruto asked slowly, always better to have an idea of your opponent. Couldn't be too reckless with S ranks. You weren't on the list of potential Akatsuki members? Jiraiya didn't know all their members, but he had made some educated guesses. There weren't all that many high-level nuke-neens floating around. I'm Toby. I'm new. He replied, still with that happy tone. I have to thank you actually. Leader-sama only let me join because you killed Haiden-senpai. So, thanks for that. You're welcome, he returned bemusedly. Banter, threats, even psychotic ranting like from Haiden, he would have expected those. This childish cordiality was just surreal. So polite. You're a good boy I think, like Toby. I wouldn't be too sure about that, the blonde snarled, tensing to attack. Toby had made no move to do anything so far, but that didn't mean wasn't doing something. A shinobi could do a lot out of sight. He, for instance, currently had 3 shadow clones hiding in the nearby trees. And Teiko called him paranoid, really. No such thing for a shinobi. Hey now, you're not underestimating me, are you? Toby pouted, or so Naruto assumed from the tone. The mask made it difficult to tell. That's rude you know. All 3 of Naruto's clones popped without warning, the memories revealing they were just as clueless as to the cause as he was. He took that as his cue to attack, sprinting forward. Toby immediately threw his arms in front of him. Hey, whoa! Wait a sec here. He curled in on himself just as Naruto leapt into the air to bring a brutal axe kick down on his. Nothing. Naruto passed straight through the man and barely caught himself in time to hit the floor in a crouch and leap forward, in case Toby countered. The man did nothing of the sort though. He turned to face the blonde's new position, patting himself down frantically. Whoa, did you see that? A moment later he stopped and put a thumb to his mask, wiggling his fingers mockingly. Just kidding. Naruto could practically feel the grin underneath that mask. Pretty good for a newbie, huh? The teen pulsed his chakra rapidly, only for nothing to change. Toby crossed his arms in front of his chest in an X, making a buzzer noise. Nope, not a genjutsu. Nice guess though. Naruto scowled at his irreverent demeanor, quickly using a chain to score a line across his arm, just to be sure. Unfortunately, nothing changed again. Still, there had to be a trick to it. People didn't just pass through other people. Only one way to check. He moved forward again, more cautiously this time, with chains extended to completely cover his guard. Oh come on Naruto-kun, I just want to talk, yeah? The blonde's eyes narrowed. Don't worry, you'll still be able to talk. Toby bounced for a moment, even as the chains snapped forward, testing the man's guard. Ah, that's so. Wait a minute. That was a threat, wasn't it? The blonde shrugged with a sardonic grin, coiling his chains back to strike. It was a telegraph strike, but it was just the opening feint. Ah come on Naruto-kun, haven't we already established that's not gonna dash? He was cut off mid-sentence. Naruto wasn't sure who was more surprised, him or Toby. He had expected the man to dodge, or at least use his strange ability to avoid the chains. Instead he just stood there, allowing them to pierce his stomach and right arm. He staggered, as if surprised by the turn of events, a drop of blood falling from the bottom of his mask. Wadash! He lurched forward when Naruto viciously pulled the chains, making sure they spun on their way out to maximize the damage. He nearly fell forward, but caught himself. He put his good hand to his stomach before looking at the blood staining his glove almost dreamily. Impo, Cybele? He coughed, more blood leaking from under his mask as he glanced up at Naruto. The blonde was too confused by the display to really make sense of what was going on. Was the man really so surprised that he could bleed? What kind of S rank was this? He never got an answer, as the man's form began to distort, swirling inwards around his eye. A moment later he was gone, as if sucked into a whirlpool of air. The clearing was oddly quiet in his absence, and Naruto could only glance about warily, wondering if this was an elaborate trick. When nothing happened for another 2 minutes, he relaxed slightly and began to make for the village. With that teleportation trick, it wasn't hard to figure out how he had infiltrated the village. But that wasn't the only question that had been raised from this encounter. Naruto had warned the Hokage of the intrusion immediately. ANBU teams had been mobilized to make sure Tobi, although he doubted that was the man's real name, wasn't anywhere else in the village. They had found nothing, which Naruto had assumed would be the case, but it paid to be certain. Still, he was slightly disturbed by the encounter, especially in the way the man's childish demeanor had slipped right at the end, implying it was all some act. But to what end? All he could do now was mull over what he had seen, after relaying it to Jiraiya, of course. The man seemed just as troubled by it, not recognizing anything of the limited description Naruto could give. He seemed thoughtful about the transportation technique he had used to escape, but said that he would need time to check something. Still, Naruto wasn't the naturally thoughtful type, and soon found himself wandering the village, looking for a distraction. Training alone seemed unpalatable after the unexpected visitor, and Haku was busy now with her hospital work. He felt his teammates before he spotted them, not even turning as Teiko dropped to the street beside him. He was out of his ANBU uniform, which was a rare sight, instead wearing a strange green shirt of unfamiliar design and a similarly colored hat. "So?" he asked, a perverse giggle creeping into the question. "So?" Naruto mirrored with a raised eyebrow as Saru alighted on his other side, looking far more dignified in his more traditional white gi and navy hakama. He could have easily passed for a Hyuga, his eyes were even rather pale. "I believe my colleague was trying to ask how things are progressing with young Haku," he stated, earning another giggle from the blonde's left. "We saw you two kiss," Kuma announced, as he joined the group at the back. Naruto glanced back at the giant of a man in exasperation, taking in his yellow vest and red shorts. The man never truly grew out of his underground fighting days, despite the clothes looking ridiculously small on his enormous frame. Perched on Kuma's shoulder, Nezumi, dressed loosely in a surprisingly feminine pink kimono top and dark thigh-high socks, gave him a thumbs up. She also gave him a wink, but it looked strange on her otherwise neutral expression. "Do you guys spy on me all the time?" Teiko grinned, looping an arm around the teen's shoulders. "Only when we're in the village, kid." He then shot the blonde an irritated expression, noting how he had to raise his arm to patronize him. "Damn, you're taller than me now." "Ha!" Kuma barked boisterously. "Teiko's the smallest again?" The small man would have retorted, if he didn't turn to find Nezumi smirking at him. He immediately deflated. "Not you too, my sweet Nezumi-chan?" Even in his exaggerated despair he was able to dodge the shuriken she threw at him. He recovered admirably, rounding on the now taller blonde again. "So kid, how far do you get? The others wouldn't let me stay after you guys started snogging away. You'd let your old pal know all the juicy secrets, right? Was it good? Was she good?" Naruto didn't bother looking at him, especially as it would have given away the slight hit of pink to his cheeks. "We weren't snogging." Teiko's grin only grew. "I beg to differ, kid, I got pictures." He had to move his hand back like a viper, lest his camera get speared through by a chain. I bet a certain master of the literary erotica would pay handsomely for these." Naruto fought down his embarrassment and adopted his best impersonation of Nezumi's icy stare. "Pictures of two underage teens kissing? What kind of books do you want him to write?" Taking the accusation in stride, it wasn't as if he wasn't used to the abuse, Teiko simply smirked in triumph. "So, you admit it." This time Naruto joined Nezumi in trying to perforate him with shuriken. Obito stumbled as he emerged from his Kamui dimension, ripping his mask off and throwing it across the room. Swirly. The strangely patterned Zetsu rushed into the room, immediately fretting over the state of the Uchiha. "Ah, young master. What have you done now?" Obito simply growled, clutching at the wound in his stomach. He was less worried about his arm, the grafted flesh was more easily replaced and felt no pain. "Shut up and heal me already." Swirly sighed theatrically, his body opening up along it seems to admit the injured Uchiha. Obito climbed in, immediately sighing in relief when the Zetsu closed over his wound, sealing it shut and starting the healing process. "So, what happened to you anyway?" the strange creature asked, head remaining unfurled yet having no difficulty speaking. "Lucky shot," Obito snarled, wincing when the action irritated his wound. "Must have been, to catch you outside your Kamui." "Oh, hey, they damaged your stomach. That's the part that makes poop, right?" Obito ignored the creature's disturbing fascination with bodily ablutions and staggered over to his bed. The underground hideout he had transported himself to, more on instinct than any real plan, was Spartan, but it had the essentials. He idly wondered how Madara had survived after growing used to the luxuries afforded to the Uchiha clan head. But then, he wondered how and why Madara did a lot of things. It didn't matter now, the bastard was dead and Obito hoped he stayed that way. He pulled his mind back to the present and scowled. He had called it a lucky shot, but it was nothing of the sort. His Kamui had been active, he knew it was, but that brat's chains had ignored it like it was nothing. He hated the sight of them. It reminded him of a past he wanted to leave forgotten. Of his sensei's wife and the very similar chains she had used. Of course, Kushina would never have used them so violently. Kakashi. Get me out of this stupid thing. He shouted, trying not to be sick from the way the snare had him swaying about, upside down. Kakashi. I said let me down you bastard. He struggled, only serving to tighten the thin loop of ninja wire around his ankle. He couldn't even cut it with a kunai. Damn Jounin getting all the best gear. Damn Kakashi for being such a damn prodigy that he got to be a damn Jounin so young and mess up Obito's damn life. Damn. Now, I don't think that's proper language for a budding young ninja, he heard, before the wire was suddenly severed, dropping him to the ground. He had his wits about him enough at least to twist and land on his feet. Small mercies. Kushina-san. You see I was just. He trailed off to the sound of her laughter and found himself grinning sheepishly, rubbing the back of his head. Not wanting to meet her eye with his cheeks almost as red as her hair, he was instead drawn to the softly glowing construct of chakra emerging from her back. No doubt how she had released him. Whoa, is that one of your chakra chains? The woman glanced at her own technique as if uncertain what to think of it. Oh, these? Minakuin told you about that? He nodded happily. Minato-sensei was always talking about his fiancée when he got into a thoughtful mood. That, or wondering which absurd name he should give to his various techniques. Obito-sensei was a unique man. He told us all they were like, some super special Uzumaki family technique. Kushina gained a healthy blush at that, regarding the chain at her side more fondly. Well, I don't know about special. She pursed her lips, putting a finger to them thoughtfully, although, Mito-san did often say something like that. She seemed to dwell on that for a moment before shrugging irreverently. To me, they're just another way I can protect my precious people. Obito grinned, remembering something else their sensei had told them. And steal bowls of ramen, right? With her warm, motherly appearance, it was easy to forget that Kushina was a dangerous kunoichi in her own right. Obito was given a stark reminder as the woman crossed the distance between them so fast it was like she had used her fiancé's technique. What was that, Obito-kun? She warned in a dangerous tone, the ends of her hair beginning to split into 9 distinct tails and sway ominously. Nothing, Kushina-san. Nothing. She bopped a fist on his head, the dangerous aura vanishing. It was replaced by a cheeky smirk as the woman stuck her tongue out at him. Thought so. Obito shook his head of the memory. The past should stay in the past, until he could erase it altogether. He sank onto the bed, feeling Swirly go to work repairing his body. Releasing a sigh, knowing that he was going to be here a while, he let his head loll back against the wall. Special, huh? Still keeping secrets right to the end, huh, sensei? He shook his head again, lest his mind wander too far down that path onto more painful topics. Instead his eyes hardened, mind whirring into action as he planned how to deal with this. Sensei's son, no, the Kyuubi Jinchuriki, was now too dangerous to leave alone. The Akatsuki still wasn't ready to move on all of the Jinchuriki, and the Nine Tails would have to be one of the last sealed, but that didn't mean they had to sit on their hands in the meantime. He considered who to send. Sasori had been getting antsy, but he dismissed the idea as soon as it formed. They still hadn't found the puppeteer a new partner since Orochimaru's betrayal. Besides, the Kyuubi Jinchuriki had already displayed the ability to kill somebody as tenacious as Haiden. He couldn't trust Sasori's brand of immortality to protect him any better. No, there was no sense holding back the big guns on this one. Time to pull Nagato out of his ivory tower. Chapter 26, 26th Link. Do you have to be so dour, kid? Jiraiya complained as the two made their way along the wide, well-paved road that marked Fire Country's main highway. If I wanted pensive and introspective from my companions, I would have brought along Sarutobi-sensei's killjoy son. Naruto shot him an irritated glance before looking ahead again. Because I have so much to be happy about, right? Jiraiya prodded him in the chest. And what, exactly, do you have to be unhappy about? Your training's going well. You have unparalleled control of your bijou for your age. You're nearly tall enough that I'll have to stop calling you shrimp. And I've heard things are starting to heat up between you and your little sub-friend. That earned him a scathing look or irritation. Best of all, you get to be out here with me on this glorious day. He gestured in his usual flamboyant way and Naruto felt the annoyance drain out of him. Kami, he was actually getting used to the buffoon. Yes, out here on a mission with you. The track record for those seems to leave me either bored, wanting to kill somebody, actually killing somebody, getting attacked by the Akatsuki, or some combination of the above. Which will it be today, I wonder? Well, that's a pessimistic way of looking at it, Jiraiya mused, his face hardly reflecting the sentiment as he grinned unashamedly. But if you're that concerned about getting attacked. Not what I said, Naruto clarified quickly, although Jiraiya ignored him and soldiered on. Then you'll be happy to know this will be as boring as they come. Just some border dispute way up in the north. Normally something I wouldn't even trouble myself over, but it pays to be especially cautious when it comes to rice country. Old Snakeface can be a tricky player, and even the slightest things can indicate what he's up to. Like what? Naruto wouldn't admit it to the man, but he did actually find components of his spy network somewhat interesting. Funny thing actually, the way I originally discovered which country Orochimaru had set up shop in was from disparities in grain exports of all things. Sometimes kid, it's the minor details? The blonde smirked. Little things, like the fact that the Hokage's been hounding you over his succession? Jiraiya glanced down at him and his smirk widened. I've noticed you've picked up the rate you've been taking me out on missions. Wouldn't be avoiding your sensei, would you? You can't prove squat? Still haven't been able to convince Lady Tsunade to consider it? He stressed the title sarcastically. The woman had been anything but a lady since returning. She was still traipsing around in her prepubescent body, getting a kick out of ordering around people who looked to be twice her age, despite being twice their age herself. I'm still working on that. Naruto waved his hand noncommittedly, not buying it for a second. Why the sudden interest? You finally seen the light and realized how much of a kick-ass Hokage I'd be. Despite himself, Naruto snorted. Have you? He gestured around them. The very fact Jiraiya was essentially goofing off with him on these pointless little excursions was a point against him. You wound me, kid. Who else would make a better leader? Naruto knew the man was only joking. For being so outwardly confident, he could be rather self-deprecating at times. Still, he knew when he was being baited and decided to play along, feigning exasperation. What about the ANBU commander? He had only met Ukami a few times in his official capacity, but the man was supposed to be the very best of what ANBU represented. Strong, discreet, organized, loyal. Every ANBU was supposed to aspire to that mask. Bah, that grump? He'd turned the village into a nightmare in weeks. An efficient nightmare, I'll give him, but he's no people person, that's for sure. What about Shikaku? The head of the Nara clan was supposed to be an unparalleled tactical genius, able to think hundreds of steps ahead of his opponents. Maybe, if the world was a shogi board. He'd be a good leader for sure, but a Kage is more than a tactician, and Shikaku isn't the best fighter. What about Guy then? He immediately regretted saying it. It had been the first thought that popped into his head when thinking about strength, and there was no question the ludicrously dressed man was monstrously strong, but the sheer thought of it left him shuddering. Jiraiya wasn't much better. Don't joke about that, kid. We'd all be wearing skin-tight spandex, screaming about youth within the week. Okay, then what about Kakashi? He was strong, had well-developed international reputation, was supposed to be incredibly intelligent, although he rarely showed it, and had experience teaching. A few years ago I might have considered him a candidate, but the more I hang around that kid, the more I realize he has a boatload of issues he needs to work through before he's ready to lead anything. Naruto was surprised by the frank summation. Asuma? Good connections, not strong enough. Tenzo? God, that's a publicity nightmare waiting to happen. Hayashi Hyuga? Balancing the clan politics is hard enough without throwing in a wrench like that. That's it then. So why do you think Tsunade would make such a good candidate if you shot down all of them? Well, she's undoubtedly strong, Jiraiya explained, ticking each point off his fingers. Despite her surly manner, people like her. She's got the heritage for it, with her grandfather and granduncle. She was trained by a former Hokage, and she has the endorsement of a Sannin. Naruto remained skeptical. She's also a habitual alcoholic, foists all of her paperwork onto her subordinates, solves most of her arguments with threats or outright violence and I'm not sure if I can stress this hard enough, doesn't want the job. Jiraiya announced in a faux-sagely manner, but sometimes, the person best suited for the job is the one who never wanted it to begin with. Better than some power-grabbing career politician like Danzo, that's for sure. He shrugged, a surprisingly sincere expression gracing his features. Besides kid, I know Tsunade. She acts surly and disinterested, but I know she would make a wonderful leader if she gave it a chance. Sometimes, we only really know what people are capable of when responsibility is thrust on them. And people call me oblivious, Naruto muttered under his breath before turning to regard the Sannin. A moment later he internally shrugged, rolling his eyes. Careful, your persona was slipping for a moment. Jiraiya simply grinned, striding forward with his usual boisterous gait. No idea what you're talking about, shrimp. Thought you said I was too tall to call that now? Almost kid, almost too tall. He looked up thoughtfully, but the image was ruined by the lecherous smile that grew across his face like a fungus. I feel like we got off topic there. We were talking about what had you so dour. Trouble in Paradash. It came suddenly. One moment they were walking along in peace, the next, Jiraiya had thrown him back. It was just in time. As if in slow motion, Naruto watched a thin black rod pass in front of his vision. If Jiraiya hadn't acted, it would have speared right into his arm. He hadn't noticed a thing. He tucked into a roll, landing back on his feet just as the strange matte black spear slammed into a tree on the other side of the road. It hit with such explosive force that it tore a great wedge right out of the trunk, uprooting half the tree. If that had hit him, well, it wouldn't have killed him, but he might not have an arm anymore. The fact that he hadn't noticed it until it would have been too late was disconcerting. As quick as ever, Jiraiya-sensei, a deep voice mused from just beyond the path. It belonged to a tall, orange-haired man in the uniform of the Akatsuki. That alone was enough to set Naruto on edge, only marginally soothed by Jiraiya's presence. Piercings covered the man's face, 3 black bars through his nose, many more through his ears, and 2 spikes jutting from his lower lip like tiny black fangs. It was an unsettling visage. What really got his hackles up though, were the man's eyes, a steely gray filled with thin, concentric circles. Something in him stirred discomfortingly when that gaze swept over him. He was certain it was a jujitsu, but he had never seen anything like it. The cross-through aim headband should have given him some indication of the man's identity, but he had never heard of the village hidden in the rain producing any S-rank shinobi except for Sanshou no Hanzo, never mind a missing nin of such a caliber. He clearly wasn't the only one shocked. Jiraiya couldn't take his eyes off the man's face. Yahiko? Naruto glanced across at his companion in surprise. Jiraiya's tone implied familiarity, but no hostility. You know him? The frank question seemed to jar the man out of his daze, his face quickly setting into a grim mask. I thought I did, part of a trio of orphans I helped and trained a bit after the Second Shinobi War. Naruto tensed even more. Great, so the man was not only strong enough to be in the Akatsuki, but also trained by a Sannin. Fascinating glimpse into your past aside, any idea why he wants me dead? No clue. Last I heard, that same trio were dead. His gaze, cautious and wary, returned to Yahiko. He was clearly uncertain on how to proceed, and that kind of sentimentality was dangerous here. Yahiko is dead, sensei, now there is only pain. Naruto did not like the way Jiraiya's eyes narrowed at that name, and he was apparently correct to feel that way. I heard rumors that some mysterious shinobi calling himself that killed Hanzo and took over AIM. I didn't believe them, of course, even slowed down by age I couldn't imagine the salamander giving up his iron grip on the country. Yahiko, or Pain, or whoever, regarded him evenly. Hanzo's skills were greatly diminished, both by age and paranoia. I had imagined such divine satisfaction from seeing him and all those close to him crushed. Instead, it was trivially hollow. A god, it seems, cannot find pleasure in the destruction of ants. Jiraiya tried for a jovial tone, but it came out forced. Calling yourself a god now, huh? That's a departure from the bumbling brat I remember. The mirth drained from his tone as he spoke. And those eyes. What happened to Nagato? Why do you have the Rinnegan, Yahiko? Naruto started. He might not have recognized the man's jujitsu by sight, and once revealed it was no wonder why, but he recognized that name from some of Saru's historical ramblings. S-Class, Akatsuki, trained by Jiraiya, Eyes of the Rikudo Sannin. Naruto may have enjoyed a fight against a strong opponent, but he still felt he could draw the line at outright suicide. I told you once, sensei, Yahiko is dead. We are Pain. He swiftly demonstrated that this was not the royal we as 5 other figures emerged from the tree line. All of them wore the Akatsuki's robe, all of them had Yahiko's black piercings in various configurations, all of them had his orange hair, save for one that wore a traditional Suna cowl, and most terrifying of all, each possessed the Rinnegan. Impossible? Jiraiya whispered hoarsely, taking a step back in shock. 6 of you. Not impossible, sensei, simply a miracle. It was still Yahiko who spoke, the other 5 flanking him in stony silence. Come, let me show you. He raised a hand, and this time it was Naruto who acted, throwing himself to the side and using his chains to pull a frozen Jiraiya down to the ground. It was a similarly close shave. The air above them didn't so much as ripple, but the trees on the other side of the path caved and buckled as though they had been struck by an unimaginable force. Luckily, being tackled to the side was enough to rouse Jiraiya's combat instincts, and the man tucked into a tight roll and quickly regained his feet. Just in time to spot the nondescript black cartridge that had been fired between him and Naruto. The explosion must have been equivalent to an entire roll of explosive tags. Both were fully capable of defending themselves, Naruto with an instinctive barrier of chains, and Jiraiya with his needle Jizo, but the concussive force sent them flying in opposite directions. The older man knew that, outnumbered, being separated was disastrous. He suspected Pain knew that too. The moment he tried to move back towards Naruto, he was met by Yahiko's cold visage again. "I am your opponent, Jiraiya-sensei. You would be wise not to forget that." He raised his hand again and Jiraiya prepared for another of those strange, invisible blasts. It was a feint though. One of the other orange-haired men had gotten behind him, this one with long, flowing hair that would have been the envy of any Yamanaka. When Jiraiya instinctively moved back from the presumed attack, his wrist was grabbed. A terrible, haunting cold spread from the contact. When he looked down, he was sickened to find something translucent and ethereal being pulled from his body. His reflexes took over and, instead of pulling away from the other Akatsuki member, he drove his shoulder into the effeminate man's chest. The blow wasn't as effective as he would have liked. It felt like trying to shoulder barge a tree, but it was enough to loosen the grip on his wrist. He brought his hair around and slapped the man with it, transforming it into a spiky, steel-hard club at the last moment. He leapt back from both, avoiding another invisible blast that smashed through the tree line like a rampaging bull. His arm felt unnaturally cold and weak, but feeling and mobility was slowly returning. He would have to be sure not to get touched by the long-haired one again. Still, what the hell was that? Oddly, it was Yahiko who spoke. "My mastery of the Rinnegan is complete, sensei. What you just experienced was the human path." The newly named Ninjendo picked himself up, not even looking bruised from the otherwise brutal attack. He still stared forward with that same blank intensity. Jiraiya was now completely caught up in the fight and could feel the adrenaline high approaching. He knew he would have to get back to Naruto somehow, but the urge to engage in his usual fighting banter was too strong. "Well, it's creepy as all hell. Why couldn't you be more like Nagato?" Apparently Yahiko found that amusing, but Jiraiya didn't have long to muse why before the two began their attack anew. The others were nowhere in sight, and if he was struggling with two of these bastards, he worried for Naruto. Oddly enough, Naruto was thinking the same thing as he faced off against the two men that had driven him away from Jiraiya. One was the man wearing the traditional Suna headgear he had noted before, although he was damned if he could find a match for him in his internal bingo book, and the other was a portlier man with comparatively fewer, but larger, piercings. Despite their varied appearances, both bore a slashed-aim headband and, more importantly, the Rinnegan. He had been wondering about that, even as he jumped back from the latter assailant's attempt to catch him in a crushing bear hug. He knew little about the legendary Dujutsu, save for what he had overheard from Saru's musings. The gist that he remembered though, was that only the Rikudo Sannin, a historically ambiguous figure himself, had ever possessed it. There were speculations that it had evolved into the Sharingan or Byakugan over time, but those seemed like empty boasts designed to boost the respective clans' prestige. The chances that such a thing could develop in 6 different men, 7, if he understood the implications behind this Nagato character, without it being discovered before now? Astronomically low. Admittedly, the shared orange hair implied a familial connection, but Naruto's nose was sharp enough to recognize the distinctive scent of a chemical dye. Many ANBU favored an old-fashioned disguise over the traditional henge. It all frustrated the teen. Big, fuzzy puzzle pieces were floating in his head, but they refused to connect into any meaningful picture. Of course, that was the least of his worries. He was forced to jump back as the Suna-looking one turned his hand into a buzz saw, the other remained an innocuous tube that continued to shoot out explosive capsules. He was unwilling to test his chains against such a wicked-looking weapon, and instead focused on the chubby one. He knew that size was no indication of a well-trained shinobi's speed or power. The Akimichi were good examples, but right now he had a lot of frustration and anger to play about with and was using it to dredge up a sizable portion of the Kyuubi's chakra. 2 chains waved from his tailbone as he sprinted across the open ground, something he hadn't figured out how to stop since gaining his refined control over the Bijuu's energy, while others coiled tightly around his arms. He had to admit though, they provided an excellent counterbalance, allowing him to keep low to the ground as he ran. It saved him from a bloody end when another capsule sailed over his head. One of the tail chains swatted it right back at the man, keeping him distracted as he closed on his chunky friend. They were fast, that was for sure, but surprisingly, no faster than he was. It was their durability that was the issue. He had tried to blindside one during the initial separation, attempting to spear him through right from the get-go. It was apparently surprising enough that he had no time to dodge, but apparently didn't have to. The chain glanced off his arm as if it was made of metal. This time he was taking no chances. The The chains were already sheathed in wind chakra as he approached, the familiar shriek sounding in his ear as he released their latent strain energy to get his drill spinning. The man looked ready to dodge, and would find a surprise waiting for him if he did, but at the last moment stopped. He turned, planting his feet and raising his hands in front of him, as though he could block Naruto's most piercing attack with his hands. Naruto would have scoffed, but Anbu had taught him to be wary of this kind of self-assuredness. He was committed to the attack now, although he allowed his second tail chain to dig into the ground, providing him another point of leverage. It probably saved his life. The moment he brought his chain drill into some invisible bubble around the hefty Akatsuki member, it simply dissolved. No lights, no called-out technique, the chakra comprising his chains just vanished. The man didn't even look winded, despite the impossibility of the action. Naruto quickly realized why when he sprung forward in a sudden burst of energy. It was only the anchoring chain Naruto left behind that allowed him to pull back and prevent himself being crushed again. He flipped back and landed in a three-point stance, glaring at the bigger man far more warily. He had thought the other one the greater danger and rebuked himself silently for falling into the trap of being swayed by flashier, more overt techniques. It was the quiet ones he had to pay attention to, especially when they could absorb your chakra. "Fine, we can do this the old-fashioned way," he muttered, drawing the sword from his back. He was glad he'd gotten it replaced after his confrontation with Guren. He wouldn't want to go at a chakra thief in hand-to-hand. His chains suddenly whipped around, reacting to something caught in the periphery of his vision. They caught the capsule mid-flight, swarming like a nest of snakes to encase it completely. A moment later they bulged, containing the explosion and allowing the blonde to shoot a poisonous glance at the human multi-tool that fired it. "Yeah, I haven't forgotten about you either." His breathing picked up slightly as another chaintail slipped out of his spine, the whisker marks on his cheeks deepening. "That's right, just keep making me angrier." Jiraiya used the trees to his advantage, leading the two on a merry chase as he focused his chakra. It still irked him that he was forced to keep his hands in a ram seal, but this took a lot of concentration, even for him. Still, he was far from defenseless. He kicked off a tree trunk just before it was crushed into splinters by another invisible force. Yahiko had repeatedly demonstrated his ability to both pull and push with incredible force. Shinra Tensei and Bancho Tenin. The happy-go-lucky survivor that had so brazenly challenged him all those years ago would have never come up with names so pretentious. What had happened to those three? And where were Nagato and Konan? He turned his kick into a spin, using the momentum to launch a crushing kick at the human path. Again, naming his companions after the 6 circles of existence in the cycle of samsara, how utterly condescending. So far, all this guy had displayed was a well above average speed and durability and that horrific ability to, well, Jiraiya didn't really want to think about it. Instead, he hardened the end of his hair, using it as a counterweight to twist his body around the long-haired man. The moment his Geta-clad feet touched ground he spun, using all the twisted tension in his muscles to crush the man's spine with a devastating roundhouse. Unfortunately, with almost preternatural reflexes, the man turned, diverting the kick to the side and avoiding the worst of it. Jiraiya cursed, accepting the loss as he skipped back, noting how Yahiko was staring at him imperiously a short distance away. Something was nagging at the back of his mind about that. Deciding to test a theory, he swung his hair around again, making sure to only harden it at the last moment so that it had as much momentum as possible. Instead of attacking though, he hit the ground. A great cloud of dirt and leaves rose into the air. He already saw Yahiko's arm raised, no doubt to blast the distraction away. It wasn't a distraction though, it was cover. He dove into the dust, spinning adroitly until he was behind the human path again. He repeated his maneuver, this time with the full force of his needle Jizo, and this time he succeeded. The long-haired Akatsuki member flew through the air, back arched from the crushing force of the blow. A moment later the obscuring cloud was blown away, but Jiraiya was already grinning. They didn't just share the Rinnegan, they shared fields of vision. The elation at figuring the trick out was quickly dampened with worry. That ability was dangerous with 2 people, how was Naruto dealing with 4? The only reason he wasn't panicking was the fact that Yahiko was still fighting. He was sure that if they had managed to capture the blonde, they would have pulled back. Plus, the tyke was rambunctious. Nobody wasn't going to take him without a hell of a fight. Speaking of which, his grin returned in full force as he felt his chakra calm at last. He wasted no time in slamming his hand into the ground, focusing intently on his desired target. Kuchios no Jutsu. He was swallowed by another cloud of smoke, just as the human path sprinted at him, no doubt retaliating for the earlier blow. The man re-emerged not a moment later, flying back out of the smoke like a kunai. He hit a tree and just kept going, limbs flying at awkward angles. Yahiko watched all of this dispassionately. His path hadn't caught what his former sensei had done, but it was something powerful to damage it so badly. He didn't have to wonder long. The smoke cleared quickly, revealing an interesting sight. Jiraiya stood in the same spot, changed. He hadn't grown any taller, but somehow his presence seemed more daunting. His nose had grown bulbous, the warts more pronounced. The red tattoos below his eyes had extended into looping patterns and his eyes were now tiny and beady, with thin bars for pupils. Most absurdly though, two small toads perched on his shoulder, both clearly ancient by the standards of summons. "You never showed us this, Jiraiya-sensei," Pain intoned calmly, not overly concerned by the strange transformation. The man simply grinned. A teacher never reveals all their secrets. "Although, I guess I can make a few exceptions for you, Yuhiko." His grin vanished as he settled into a confident stance. "Here, why don't I show you a few?" Naruto thought that, all things considered, he was holding his own quite well. Unfortunately, quite well wasn't good enough. Any time he would try to take one of the Akatsuki out, the other would cover for their respective weaknesses. He had worked out that the one who could change his body into various weapons was surprisingly fragile and couldn't hope to survive if he got enough chains in place. Likewise, the tubby one only had his chakra absorption ability to use. Naruto was sure that with 4 tails of the Kyuubi's chakra he could shred him, if he could just get close enough. They covered each other well though. Ginger stopped his chains from ripping the cowled one apart, and Baldy threw explosives like they were endless whenever he tried to get close to the absorbing one. He scowled as he rose into the air, supported by his chains like a gangly spider. He really needed better internal names for these assholes. "Who the hell am I fighting, anyway?" he called out, voice only slightly distorted by the Bijuu's noxious energy. "Kakito," the fat one intoned monotonously. "Shurato," the other one followed up, surprising Naruto with how easy that was, and how especially creepy these guys were when they spoke. Naruto sneered as he raised himself a little higher, the 4 tail-like chains swaying beneath him threateningly. "Pretapath and Azurapath? Why are the strong ones always either nuts, eccentric, or just straight-up pretentious? What's wrong with a damn name? Mine's a bloody ramen topping, you don't hear me changing it to Lord Uzumaki, kami of all creation." The two Akatsuki merely observed him, neither rising to, or even acknowledging the jab. The Azura Path merely raised his arm and fired another capsule. Naruto swatted it away with a chain long before it reached anywhere close to him. It wasn't an explosive though. Once it reached the zenith of its arc, it burst outward into a thick cloud of black smoke that immediately enveloped the area around him. At the same time, the Pretapath rushed forward, hands outstretched as he extended his chakra absorption field as wide as it would go. As he passed underneath the suspended blonde, the chains that anchored him to the ground dissipated, dropping him to the ground. The tubby man immediately realized his mistake when he saw Naruto drop out of the cloud with a grin, sword raised. The Azura Path tried to respond, but his companion had positioned himself directly underneath the blonde and Naruto was falling too fast. He tried to shift his arms into a single long barrel that glowed threateningly, but by the time he fired a lance of pure energy, no doubt incredibly dangerous, it was too late. Naruto tucked his body into a ball and allowed the beam to pass over his head. At the last moment he unfurled, knowing that using his chains was useless in this one's presence. Instead his sword flashed out as Nezumi had taught him, diverting the vicious-looking black rod that Kakito produced from his sleeve. He continued that spin, feeling his abdomen wrench uncomfortably as the centripetal force from his own maneuver nearly tore his sword right out of his hands. He held on though, delivering a wicked slash across the Pretapath's chest. He felt the sword bite deep and grinned, aiming to press his advantage. It was the moment of overconfidence that left his footing uncertain when the ground beneath him suddenly burst open. He only jumped up in time to avoid being swallowed by the monstrosity that dug its way out of the ground. He still took a nasty gash to the leg from one of its mandibles. It really was an ugly thing. Jet black with a bright orange highlights, as well as an enormous black spike stabbed through its head. It was an enormous centipede, he could tell that much, and likely some kind of summon. That wasn't what grabbed his focus though as it stared down at him menacingly, body curled back and poised to strike. "Does anybody here not have the Rinnegan?" he growled, exhaling a long breath as the cut on his leg healed rapidly. Still, staring down the hideous summon and feeling the odds of the encounter increasingly shift against him at least inflamed his anger. Neither of these two had summoned the creature, he would have noticed something so blatant. That meant one of the others was hiding nearby. His grin became vicious from the influx of power to his system. If they were hiding, it meant they didn't think they stacked up in a head-on fight. He would like to see if they were right. For miles away, a certain monkey-masked ANBU's head snapped to the right as he felt the distant, oppressive feeling of the Kyuubi's chakra. "I felt it, too," Nezumi confirmed quietly, staring into the distance worriedly behind her own mask. They were on their way to a mission, but all four of them had stopped when they felt that familiar sensation. That's a lot, Kuma added. Naruto rarely pushed himself that far even in training, only going farther once. Well, Teiko said, trying to keep his voice light despite the anxiety he felt. Shall we go see what kind of trouble our little Kohai's gotten himself into? Chapter 27, 27th Link. The ground cratered where Jiraiya landed, feet spread wide in a sturdy stance. That seemed to be the theme of his transformation, Pain mused, durability. He was faster, stronger and tougher, his jutsu more powerful, and he seemed to react with a preternatural quickness that had little to do with his enhanced senses. It was as though an invisible field hovered around his old sensei's body, informing him through some sixth sense when anything got too close. The first blow to his human path had been no joke. To a lesser being it would have been instant death, the spine powdered and the body broken. As it was, he had been forced to bring out his Naraka path from where it had been hiding nearby. He was sure Jiraiya had noticed the figure, just as he was sure the man continued to hold that suspicion when the human path returned to the fight, completely healed from what should have, at the very least, been a crippling injury. Despite his claims of divinity, despite everything he preached with undeniable conviction, Pain was nervous. Nervous of that white-haired man he could remember so clearly. The sensei to three little orphans with unshakable self-confidence and a deserved air of power and mystery. He had seemed like he knew everything back then, a friend, a teacher and a father figure to all three of them. And now he was fighting that very same man, his power divided by necessity to keep him apart from the Kyubi Jinchuriki. The child had proven irritatingly difficult to pin down. He had impressive control of the beast's chakra and was clearly well trained in its use. While he had paired up the two paths most suited to covering each other's weaknesses, he remained elusive. It had annoyed him to commit the animal path. He had been flying the body away from the conflict, in the hopes that when they inevitably captured the Jinchuriki, they could be summoned a safe distance away, far enough that Jiraiya would be unable to follow. That plan was now untenable. Still, the combined power of three paths should be more than enough to handle the child. They would have to leave in a more conventional sense, but with the diversity of summons he could bring to bear, that shouldn't prove much of an issue. What remained was to keep Jiraiya busy until then. He refused to admit how difficult that prospect now seemed. He raised an arm and felt that familiar surge of power travel from his eyes to his hand. Bancho Tenin, he whispered, the volume of the proclamation having no bearing on the power. He targeted Jiraiya directly, suddenly pulling the man towards him from where he had been holding off a joint assault from the Naraka and human paths. If only he could stab the man with one of his chakra rods, he could disturb whatever strange technique sustained his immense strength. He prepared one at his side, forming it from pure chakra and catching it deftly as it dropped from his sleeve. Jiraiya was far from unprepared though, twisting his body adroitly in midair and suddenly taking a deep breath in. Pain remained unconcerned until the two elderly toads on his shoulders joined him in the act and he felt just how much chakra they were molding into the jutsu. Sage art, Gomen. The Sannin called in a strangled tone, before releasing his breath and spitting out a fountain of thick, viscous oil. The two toads on either shoulder spat out complementary gouts of wind and flame, the three streams of volatile elements combining into one great funnel of raging heat. It surged forth, only hastened by Pain's technique pulling it forward. Nearby trees caught flame just from its proximity, and he could feel its overwhelming heat long before it drew near. He abandoned the universal pull, instead crushing the chakra rod back into pure energy and reabsorbing it. He channeled that power into his free hand, eyes pulsing urgently. Shinra Tensei. The roiling sea of superheated oil parted, an enormous scoop ripped out and sent flying back towards its progenitors. It never made contact. Jiraiya had wasted no time in following up his technique, a sound like a contained whirlwind suddenly roaring to life. The sage burst through his own technique, clutching an enormous sphere of pure chakra in his outstretched hand. Pain had only a moment to feel awe at his sensei's accomplishment. Pure shape manipulation on such a scale was truly worthy of his legendary reputation. The big ball Rasengan never reached him though. The senjutsu-enhanced man was tackled out of the air by his human path. The moment the puppet body got its hands on the man he began to pull, drawing out the man's soul. It seemed harder now, like he was trying to uproot a tree, and that extra resistance gave Jiraiya time to twist and lash out with a bone-shattering kick that sent Ninjendo flying off into the tree line. Pain absently directed Jigakudo to go and fix him, noting how Jiraiya's eyes tracked the other figure sprint off after the human path. He couldn't allow that suspicion to fester. Jiraiya had already proven more than equipped to deal lasting damage to his paths. This enhancement is most impressive, Jiraiya-sensei, but it is still not enough in the face of God. Aha, the man retorted, beady eyes flicking back to his old student. I'm guessing that with the little naming theme you've got going on, that would make you Tendo? Pain shrugged, neither confirming nor denying the assumption, simply stating, "We are pain. It is the message we bring to the world. One of understanding over shared loss. I never taught you arrogance like this, Yuhiko." Pain barely twitched at the reminder of such an old wound. "I thought you would be proud, sensei. We seek the same thing you do." Jiraiya's lips merely twisted. "I highly doubt that." Naruto growled as he rolled to the side, chains whipping out ineffectually. They scored lines across the newly summoned rhino, but even as it shrunk back in pain, the Azura path rushed forward. A segmented blade, emerging from its back like a flat tail, struck forward with the speed of a scorpion. Chains bloomed around him and the tail bounced off a hasty barrier, but then the Preta path was there, wading right through his technique as if it wasn't there. He made to close the distance so he could get rid of the irritating chakra absorber, and took a pincer through the side for his trouble. The blow sent him spinning through the air, and he would have been bird food for an enormous, drill-beaked monstrosity if he didn't react on long-ingrained instincts. Chains wrapped up his arm and he used their extra strength to grab onto the thing's beak before it could swallow him. He'd already been through that with the damn chameleon. Not again. The bird thing tried to crush him, and failing that, began swinging its head about to dislodge him. He didn't fancy the 5-story drop though and instead used a chain to swing up into the beast's back. A few more chains and he managed to tangle its wings up, bringing it down in a nasty free fall. The cloud of smoke from it returning to whatever hell it had been summoned from cushioned his fall, but also obscured his vision. The thin black rod took him in the back, inches from his spine. Immediately his chains began to fizzle and distort, the chakra leaking out of them as he lost control of the technique. He ripped the rod out of his back a moment later, hurling it like a spear at the Preta path. The chains snapped back into focus and the Kyuubi's chakra went to work healing the wound, but he could feel the dip in his reserves. He was losing ground here. He crossed his fingers and burst into 10 identical duplicates, half of them immediately dogpiling the Azura path. They wouldn't do much damage, but they could be very distracting. Most of the others obstructed the furious summons, weary of cutting them after the incident with the multi-headed dog. It had taken one of Pain's own chakra rods, stolen from the Pretapath's hands, to get rid of that little slice of hell. He charged Gakido, chains falling flush against his body where he couldn't steal their energy, and drew his sword. It hadn't proved much use so far, but it was better than going hand-to-hand with the tubby brute. He had already determined that the Pretapath could only absorb chakra in a thin shell around his body, that he could expand or contract at will. Inside that bubble it was fair game, but if the orange-haired man got a grip on him, he could absorb the chakra right out of his body. He feinted at the last moment, throwing his sword forward with a chain-enhanced throw. The big man was forced to block it with a hastily created chakra rod. In that moment, where sparks flew, his chains sprung outward again, each carrying a shuriken, and flew around Gakido. The moment they reached the zenith of their arc they snapped back elastically, pulling their shuriken with them. The Pretapath blocked the threat instinctively, absorbing the chakra from the chains, but even with them gone the shuriken flew forward unimpeded, lodging themselves into the man's back. It was far from a crippling blow, but in that split-second moment of distraction, Naruto closed the distance, throwing his fist forward with a furious yell. Gakido might have been able to absorb the chains around his fist, but he couldn't reach the ones crisscrossing his back in careful patterns. They pulled taut and Naruto's fist slammed into the man's face with the force of a sledgehammer, throwing both of them back. Naruto found his feet, shaking his assuredly broken hand with a hiss. The Pretapath wasn't so lucky, sent skidding across the ground in an uncontrolled flight. The blonde almost wanted to cry out about the unfairness when the Akatsuki member proceeded to pick himself up again, only to notice something strange. His punch had managed to tear out some of the piercings on the left side of his face. Not only were the sudden wounds not bleeding, odd enough on its own, but the man's face was suddenly sagging as though he had suffered a terminal stroke. Most notably, the man's left eye was no longer bore the rippled pattern of the Rinnegan. It was instead a glassy brown. Naruto had seen those sorts of eyes before 1,000 times. The eyes of a dead man. The blonde's moment of realization was interrupted by a faint whistle and, acting on reflex, he scrambled out of the way of an explosive canister. His clones hadn't held up Shirato for very long. He was caught by the edge of the blast, picked up and tossed ungracefully across the open ground towards the Pretapath. For all that the man had apparently lost one of his jujitsu, he hadn't slowed down at all. A chakra rod was already in his hand, waiting to impale the flailing blonde. It instead met hard steel. That was sloppy, Nozomi admonished as she diverted the blow to the side with ease, following up with a lightning-fast swipe that forced the Pretapath to dance back. Naruto simply huffed from over Kuma's shoulder, not lowering himself to thanking the man for catching him out of the air. "She's right, Naruto," Saru said as he and Teiko touched down from their hard sprint through the trees, quickly glancing around to get a lay of the land. It was to his credit that he didn't make so much as a sound when he caught sight of the Rinnegan in their opponent's eyes. Although, this is quite the situation you've found yourself in. Yeah, Naruto shot back as he snapped his wrist back into place, letting the Kyuubi's chakra do the rest. I was handling it. We can see that, Teiko muttered as he eyed up one of the ugly summons cluttering the battleground. Things appeared to have paused for now as the new arrivals were factored into Pain's plan, but they knew it wouldn't last long. Where is Jiraiya Dano? Saru asked. Naruto pointed off in the direction he had seen the man last. Kuma, go retrieve our wayward friend, Saru commanded quickly, beginning to feel the tension increase as the brief ceasefire came to a close. Anything else we should know, Naruto? He's a living weapon, he pointed at Shirato, and he absorbs chakra. A finger picked out Gakido, and somewhere, one of them is summoning these things. I don't know what they are, but they aren't people. Go for the piercings if you can. A strange calm fell over the field, before Saru shattered it, giving a short, sharp clap. You heard him, folks. Let's get to work. The lull in battle couldn't have ended more suddenly if an adjudicator had announced it. Everyone sprang back into motion at once, Kuma charging off towards the other fight, Nozomi swiftly closing the gap between her and the Preta path, Teiko fading into the background, Saru striding forward to meet the Azura path, and Naruto finally given full focus to avenge himself of those irritating summons. The ground quaked as Gamahiro slammed his sword into the earth again, striking with incredible speed for a toad the size of a large building. Jiraiya rode atop his shoulders, observing the destruction and using his heightened senses to try and pick out Pain's location. Under different circumstances, he might have summoned Gamaken, would have preferred to even. Gamahiro's personality quickly grew tiring, but Yahiko and his cronies had so far displayed little in the way of ranged attack, making Gamahiro's twin swords more useful than Gamaken's shield and Susumida. This is quite beneath me, Jiraiya Dano, the lumbering toad complained, bar-pupiled eyes flitting this way and that to track his fast-moving opponents. I thought I stipulated that I was to only be summoned for fights worthy of my blades. I assure you, hero, these guys are plenty worthy, Jiraiya mumbled back absently, trying to keep his senses attuned to the temperamental natural energy in the surroundings. It was the best way of tracking his opponents right now, but not necessarily the easiest. I fail to see how. The toad's blade swung in a wide arc, shearing through trees like butter as he caught sight of the human path. Constantly dodging makes them worthy, but I persist. You do that, Jiraiya grumbled, earning a light bop on the back of his head from Ma for the sass. If you'd just kept up your training, Jiraiya boy, you'd be able to pick out these whippersnappers in a heartbeat, Pa chastised from his other shoulder. No discipline in training, no discipline in fights. Right, Ma? You tell him. Maybe I could do it if you two stopped bickering in my ears, he complained, only earning himself 2 more bops over the head. The playful banter only masked the anxiety all three felt though. Fukasaku and Shima were plenty old enough to be familiar with the legends of the Rikudo Sannin, and facing not one opponent with the Rinnegan, but 3, filled them with unease. Although Jiraiya was beginning to work out a theory for that. Gamahiro shifted violently as an invisible force of enormous magnitude slammed into him. He skidded back through the forest, crushing trees in his path, but dug his swords into the earth to keep himself upright. On his head Jiraiya grinned as Yahiko finally revealed himself, leaping off his summon with an enormous Rasengan swirling to life above his palm. 1, 2. He fell toward his former pupil, eyes narrowed as he focused intently on the feel of the man's chakra. 3, 4. It was strange, irregular. It flowed unnaturally, bouncing about in his body instead of flowing through the natural pathways of his chakra system. 5. Shinra Tensei. Jiraiya abandoned the technique the moment he heard the first syllable uttered. He curled in on himself, hair falling about him and hardening until he resembled a spiky white ball. The blast of force met him head-on, and with no leverage he was easily picked up and thrown back. But he hadn't spent years training and fighting with his summons for nothing. Gamahiro easily picked up on his gambit, and when the upward force of Yahiko's technique petered out, he brought the flat side of his blade down on the sage, slamming him forward again. It was probably the strangest, and shortest, game of tennis in history. The spiky bullet Jiraiya had become screamed back down towards Pain with unerring accuracy. Yahiko had no time to move out of the way and, if Jiraiya timed it right, no time to summon another of his invisible blasts. If he was fighting Yahiko alone, the ploy may have worked. Instead, Ninjendo placed himself between Jiraiya and Yahiko. Luckily, Jiraiya's hair was completely infused with chakra. He had already discovered that a thin shell of chakra made whatever the human path tried to do much more difficult. He certainly didn't have time to try it before Jiraiya's body crushed him into the ground, drilling a crater into the earth without mercy. The count in his head reached 5 again and he dived out of the way, feeling the air itself complain as a large ripple of force slammed through it. He allowed pain to lead him off a bit, sparring with the man between those 5-second gaps where he could use that devastating technique. "I'm figuring out your tricks, Yahiko," he taunted, suddenly doubling back on himself and flashing through hand seals. "I'm guessing this was one you'd have rather kept secret." He slammed his hands to the ground before pain could stop him. Doton, Yomi Numa. The crater he had crushed the human path into was suddenly replaced by a deep, chakra-infused bog. It caught the Naraka path, who had been in the process of retrieving Ninjendo in order to revive him. Jiraiya hadn't worked out how yet, but all that mattered was stopping it. His hair spiked outward, individual strands suddenly shooting backwards at Yahiko like long white porcupine quills. The needle Jizo wasn't supposed to injure the man, indeed, he simply swatted the offending projectiles away with an absent surge of force, but the moment those white hairs filled the air was enough. Their shared vision was irritating to deal with, but once he had it figured out he could use it to his advantage. Pain's view of Gamahiro blocked, the forgotten summon suddenly brought both of his blades down in a devastating arc. Ninjendo and Jigakudo, swamp and all, were mercilessly crushed into the ground, filling their air with dust. Now he only had to pray that the Naraka path couldn't revive himself, or he would really be in trouble. Shinra Tensei. The momentary victory left him distracted when the quiet voice sounded out in the ensuing quiet. Jiraiya spun, his senjutsu-enhanced reflexes warning him of the imminent danger. It was the only reason the chakra rod, shot forward faster than any kunai, didn't spear through his spine. Instead it took him in the arm, piercing right through and drawing a grunt of pain out of the sage. He tried to rip it out, but it was already messing up his internal control. It was all the man could do to keep his tentative hold over the natural chakra coursing dangerously through his body. No way was he becoming one of those damn toad statues. He dropped to his knees, scrabbling at the rod. It had gone in at an angle and proved difficult to just yank out. Yahiko used the opportunity to walk forward, hand raised. No, it wasn't Yahiko. Jiraiya had suspected for a while now but hadn't wanted to accept it. The foreign chakra interfering with his own clinched it. His student was dead, and somebody, Nagato presumably, was traipsing his corpse around like a macabre puppet. Why Nagato? Why would you do this? He growled. You have no idea what we went through after you left Sensei, Pain stated in his dull monotone. The fighting, the pain, the betrayal. Through it all Yahiko maintained your ideals, lead us like nobody else could have. And in the end, when Hanzo stood before us, demanding his life for Conan's, he threw himself onto my kunai without flinching. He paused, eyes narrowing marginally. The pain of that loss was what granted me power, and now I will extend that understanding to every nation, so they too can know loss. So, they too can understand pain. Only then we will have peace. That's... Jiraiya hissed as he finally pulled the chakra rod out, feeling its effect still lingering in his system. Not what I taught you, and can you really say this is what Yahiko would have wanted? He motioned to the animated corpse in front of him. It doesn't matter what he would have wanted, Sensei. He martyred himself for his ideals, and I'm granting him the opportunity to be the figurehead of the new world I'm building. Jiraiya just sighed. I don't think I'll ever really understand what did this to you, Nagato. His control was still messed up, but he could already feel Ma and Pa begin to mold their own technique, having stayed as quiet and inconspicuous as possible until now. No Sensei, Nagato intoned with a hint of resignation, I don't think you dash. Kuma kick. Jiraiya blinked in surprise as Pain was abruptly cut off mid-sentence, sent careening back through the trees. Thanks to Sage Mode he had seen the man's face practically cave in around the tanned ANBU's knee in excruciating detail. He was sure it wouldn't put Nagato down for long, for whatever reason, sentimentality, or practicality, Yahiko's body seemed much sturdier than the others. Still, it saved him the effort of one of his last-second turnarounds. He only had so many of those left up his sleeve. Thanks Apachai. The hulk of a man, bigger and taller than even Jiraiya's impressive stature, let out a childish whine as he helped the Sannin to his feet. Jiraiya-san. It's Kuma. You know we're not supposed to say our real names, APA. The older sage nearly chuckled, he hadn't heard that old verbal tick since soon after he helped rescue the kid from his underground fighting days. Of course, my bad. I assume if you're here, the rest of your misfit squad is about? The man nodded happily. They sent me to go get you so we could all fight together. Jiraiya breathed a silent sigh of relief, that meant the others were supporting Naruto. That was a load of his mind. It was then that he noticed Pain picking himself back up, the first identifiable emotion on his face since this whole battle had begun. It probably wasn't a good sign that it was irritation. Yes, why don't we go do that? Quickly. Trees were a Konoha ninja's home. It was said they were unbeatable in forests. Tripe, of course, a determined enough shinobi will kill any opponent in any environment if given the right motivation and set of skills. Besides, Teiko was not a Konoha citizen by birth, he had migrated from the far west after his family's death. His youth was filled with cities and cramped streets and dirty air and too many people. Still, hiding was a skill ubiquitous to all environments, and Teiko was a master of them all. Slipping between the mid-afternoon shadows of the trees was child's play. Literally. Back home, the urchin gang he used to lead had made a game of sneaking between alleyways without being seen. On the other hand, sneaking between and across trees while stalking a highly dangerous prey with a jujitsu was a different prospect entirely. And he was loving it. The third Akatsuki member, Path, Corpse Puppet, or whatever they were called, was very good at hiding. Their presence was masked, their scent eliminated, their chakra suppressed, and they weren't making a sound. Unfortunately for them, they apparently shared the same arrogance as most high-level shinobi when relying on an outside technique, that it would match up to their own ability. Right now he wasn't tracking them, he was tracking the summoned creature they were hiding inside. He scoffed internally, as if they were the first person to think to use their summons like that. Based on what he could see, it was some kind of giant chameleon, appropriate, but not perfect. Something that large always left a mark on the environment, even if it was just in the way they scattered the natural denizens of the forest when they moved through. He had real respect for the Aburame clan, so few people paid attention to the insects. There was no indicative ripple or distortion in the air, like there might be for a regular invisibility jutsu. Those were notoriously difficult, and even he didn't make a habit of relying on them. Still, he could tell the chameleon's exact position from the way a tree bough was bowing a little more than it should. He grinned beneath his mask, noting how this position gave a good view of the battle going on in the nearby field. Well, if they wanted a show, who was he to disappoint? Naruto felt like he could cut loose for the first time in the fight. Surging with the Kyuubi's chakra, and with his squad around him again, he felt invincible. Chains coiled all across his body, providing timed bursts of speed and strength as he launched himself at an enormous ox summon. He met its charge head-on, slamming his hands down in a double-fisted strike at the last moment, his chains uncoiling explosively. The beast's head crashed down as if the hammer of Kami itself had struck it, cratering the ground and plowing to a stop in a thick trench of its own making. The chains unfurled from his body, slinging out to wrap around the beast's horns as he continued his own descent. He landed on its forehead and pulled, snapping the thing's neck. He continued to twist, letting go of one horn and using the other as a fulcrum to launch himself forward again. This time he angled low, sliding across the ground beneath the gigantic carapace of something that looked like the unholy offspring of a crab and a lobster. It slammed its claws on the ground ineffectually, trying to pin him down, but he was too fast. Chains trailed behind him, flaring out to wrap around the crustacean's thick, chitinous legs. He completed his little bonsai charge by sweeping up and onto the back of the thing's shell. He slammed down hard enough to drill a few chains through even its tough outer shell, earning a shrill squeal of pain. It tried to turn, ungainly claws coming up to try and scrape him off. It only served to trip itself up on his chains, crashing to the ground and blanketing the area in dust and unsettled leaves. Sorry. The blonde grunted, exerting himself as he struggled to keep the thing down as it scrabbled against his chains, but I like my crab. He finally gave up, drawing the chains back towards him before coiling him beneath him like a spring, a little more. He sprang up, finding himself high above the battlefield in less than a heartbeat, cooked. A surprising revelation to most, but Naruto actually did listen to advice once in a blue moon. When it was pointed out to him that he lacked on the ninjutsu front, he decided to do something about that. Of course, he was a simplistic person by nature, so decided to find something that was big, practical, and grew stronger the more chakra you pumped into it. He was the type who played to his strengths. Katon, Karyuden. The stream of fire was already white-hot the moment it left his mouth, and when he twisted his fingers, narrowing the stream even further, it turned a pale, near-ethereal blue. He was actually kept aloft for a few ponderous moments by the sheer force of it, before the chakra he had molded in his lungs ran out and he dropped again. This time his feet crunched on the blackened surface of what used to be a summon, before it dispersed in a cloud of smoke a moment later. He was about to turn his attention on the giant panda, which had been too slow to interfere before now, when the forest to the north erupted in a truly magnificent explosion. The wave of air alone forced Naruto back a step, causing his eyes to glint in excitement. The panda poofed away, as did the ugly bat summon that had been harassing them from the air. Good, Teiko had taken out the summoner, or at least removed them from the fight, it made no difference. It was almost funny, the subtlest of their squad's members, Teiko certainly did have an unusual flair for the dramatic. Still, no use wallowing in nostalgia when there were still opponents to fight. He gave a cursory glance across the field and decided Nozumi's fight was more pressing. Not that he doubted his teacher's skills, but he just couldn't imagine Saru not coming off the better in his fight. That, and if they managed to remove the chakra absorber, Naruto could operate a lot more effectively. That in mind, he drew his sword and launched himself forward. Time to see if all those unwanted memories of sword training in his head were actually worth a damn. In the trees, just out of sight, barely more than a shadow that was a little too thick to be natural, a single yellow eye gleamed out of the darkness. It tracked the various fights, feeling the shifts in the air that culminated with the arrival of the ANBU team. He had felt them coming, deliberating on whether it was worth intervening and slowing them down. It was certain that without their interference, Pain would, at the very least, have been able to subdue the Kyuubi Jinchuriki and escape. Was that the optimal solution though? Pain had long ago become a wild variable, strong enough that he might actually pose a threat to the overall plan if left unchecked. The boy was never supposed to take to the eyes so well, certainly not summoning the Geto Mazo. No, watching the events unfurl was the better option. It usually was for a being so used to patience. They could take advantage of this situation no matter the outcome, it was certain of that. Now it was simply a matter of ensuring the pieces fell where they should. Course of action decided, it sent a subtle signal through the earth and settled in to see how all of this concluded. Chapter 28, 28th Link. Pain moved through the forest, unhurried. He scowled, irritated by the loss of the animal path. Any escape plan he would make now would be much more difficult without removing all the obstacles in his way. The ANBU unit that had stumbled upon the fight had been unplanned. It was much harder to account for Konoha's movements since losing Sasori's more prominent spy in the village. Still, he had been handling Jiraiya perfectly well before they arrived. Dealing with a few grunts wouldn't increase the difficulty too much, even if they were putting up a remarkable fight. He watched through his remaining path's eyes, noting the woman's excellent sword technique. It was inconsequential now. With 3 of the paths taken out of commission, he could double the chakra sent to those that remained. Each was now twice as strong, and he made good use of that strength. The Azura path was always his most difficult of abilities to control, requiring both focus and precision to shift its body, but with his attention split only 3 ways it became vastly easier. The body disposed of its cloak, revealing the 4 additional arms that made its name so apropos. With its pale, shiny skin and numerous piercings, not to mention the permanent manic grin, it really did look like a demon of the second realm. The taijutsu bout only intensified, all 8 arms involved becoming a blur of motion. The monkey-masked captain shifted his feet, clearly looking for an opening, but he would never find one. His Rinnegan could see his every move, and any attempt to flank the Azura path was rendered moot by the 2 additional faces. After Tendo, it was his most powerful body. Arms strong enough to tear steel and a body tough enough to withstand the most devastating of jutsu. This man with his simple and predictable taijutsu stood no chance. He was more concerned with his Preta path. Without that one, subduing the Kyuubi Jinchuriki might prove difficult without resorting to drastic measures. The woman it was fighting proved skilled with a blade, easily fending off his flurry of swipes with a chakra rod. Off the 6, Gakido was his slowest body, hampered further by the damage done by the Jinchuriki. Its ability to absorb and use an enemy's chakra was usually enough. Irritatingly though, the woman barely seemed to use any, and only in enhancing her own body. Pure Kenjutsu was, admittedly, a poor matchup. He pressed harder, knowing that if he didn't finish her soon, one of the others might get the drop on his body. With 2 sets of eyes on the field, and the extra coverage Shirato provided, he had good visibility of the entire battlefield, but not perfect. That in mind, he forced Tendo to pick up the pace slightly. A god could never appear impatient, but he increasingly felt the need to put a swift end to this. It came too suddenly. One moment he was keeping perfect track of both fights, the next he felt one of Shirato's arms fall to its side, limp. It was quickly followed by another. He forced the body to move back, but the ANBU captain pressed forward, his arms only seeming to speed up. No, he realized, the man wasn't speeding up, the Azura path was slowing down. His connection with the puppet body was weakening. He soon realized why when he noticed the slim black piercings littering the ground at their feet. He had been so focused on where the man's hands were that he hadn't noticed what they were doing. Still, to remove his path's piercings in the middle of a taijutsu bout? His scowl returned as he forced Shirato to leap away, disengaging long enough for him to shunt chakra through the body. It bowed forward, the top of its head splitting open to reveal a metallic chamber that glowed intensely. He knew the man wouldn't be able to move out of the way in time, nothing could move faster than light. The lance of pure energy surged forward, splitting the air itself with a tremulous whine. He maintained it for a solid 3 seconds, making sure that nothing would survive, only to frown. His eyes never lied, and he detected nobody in the path of the stream, just, "You shouldn't look down in the middle of a fight," a calm voice informed him from Shirado's ears. A substitution. The taijutsu had been so natural, so fast-paced, he had almost forgotten one of the most fundamental shinobi techniques. It was too late though, and he nearly cursed as he felt his connection with the Azura path cut out completely. Through Gakito's one remaining eye he could spot the man dropping the remaining piercings to the ground, sending a glance the Preta path's way. How dare they mock God? Naruto had been carefully making his way around the field, making sure to stay out of sight of both paths. Nezumi was holding her own, and he was certain that with enough time she would come out on top. But Naruto wasn't the type to give his opponents that time. Shinobi were too fond of their last-minute reversals, and he hated dealing with those, even if the surprise was much more amusing when he still killed them regardless. He would end this with a sword through the man's spine, not even risking using his chains in case that chakra-absorbing ability extended to some kind of sense for it too. However, as he approached, keeping to his blind spot always, he found he didn't have to. One moment the man was furiously engaging with Nezumi, the next, he slumped to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. It would have almost been funny if it wasn't so confusing. Incoming! Jiraiya called as he and Kuma emerged from the forest, skidding to a stop and quickly taking stock of the situation. Pain emerged a few seconds later, calmly pacing forward. The slight frown marring his features was the only indication of his displeasure. "This has gone on long enough," he announced solemnly, gazing at the assembled Konoha ninja with a gaze far more piercing than anything from his other paths. "Tall words, Nagato," Jiraiya called back with his characteristic grin. His arm was hanging by his side limply, but he seemed otherwise unhurt. "By my count, you're down to your last puppet." "You understand nothing, sensei," Pain answered, eyes narrowing. Naruto intended to get that particular story out of the Sannin later. "Every path that I lose allows me to funnel more power into the remaining bodies, exponentially. You stand no chance against me. Surrender the Kyubi Jinchuriki, and I may yet let you go unharmed." The white-haired man glanced at Naruto and quirked an eyebrow. "Couldn't make him if I wanted to." His expression hardened. "But you're right, Nagato, things have gone far enough. I don't know what drove you to this, but I'm putting an end to it now." Off to the side, Saru coughed into his sleeve, making Jiraiya roll his eyes. "We're putting an end to it." Pain gave all of them an even look, before inclining his head slightly. "If that is what you have decided?" Teiko chose that moment to attack, flying out of the tree-line without so much as a whisper. His arm was outstretched in preparation for a knife-handed strike. The faintest coating of chakra fluttered around the very tips of his fingers, granting them a keener edge than most swords. It was a textbook ambush, never leaving Pain's blind spot for a moment. It would sever the man's spine cleanly at the neck, an instant, painless death, if he wasn't already a corpse. Pain didn't even turn around, he simply moved an arm behind him, caught Teiko by the neck and promptly slammed the man into the ground. Crack spreads through the earth and they could all hear the faint gasp of the air being forced from the small man's lungs. Pain hadn't stopped looking at them for a moment. "It appears I am being underestimated still," he said, face setting back into a neutral mask. He hadn't even finished speaking before Nezumi had crossed the distance between them. Her sword flashed out, faster than Naruto had ever seen it move. Faint whistles seemed to follow her blade, out of sync slightly from the sheer speed of her strikes. Pain had already drawn a chakra rod, deflecting the blade to the side every time before flexing his hand and blasting the swordswoman back with an invisible blast. He regarded the black pole in his hand, noting the deep scratches along its length, more than he had thought the woman had connected. "That is actually fairly impressive," he intoned blandly, stepping back slightly as Saru suddenly invaded his guard, arms and feet a blur as he attempted to replicate his stunt with Shirado. Pain was wise to it this time, using his battered rod to strike at the man's hands before they could get close to his body. "Only a monkey would try the same trick twice," he commented, eyes tracking the rapid movements with ease. "Only a fool assumes he is the smartest man present," came the mirthful retort from under the mask. Pain diverted his body to the side, avoiding the stream of golden chains aiming to perforate him. He continued spinning, lashing out with a kick that drove Saru back. It nearly cost him the leg. Jiraiya was suddenly in front of him, a Rasengan pulsing energetically in his hand. Pain's eyes bulged slightly and the man was thrown back, tucking in on himself to mitigate the sudden reversal of momentum. Nezumi had recovered by then, aiming to sweep his legs out from under him, or remove them entirely. He raised a foot and stomped on the blade, driving it into the earth. By all rights it should have shattered under the force. Samurai and Tetsu no Kuni would have bled for such a sword. She either predicted the move, or improvised well, using the leverage of the ground to drive the foot back up. Pain was surprised enough by the blade's survival that he was unbalanced by the sudden reversal. He nearly took a chain in the shoulder for it, leaning back at the last moment. The bladed chakra construct flew past and he reached out, grabbing a hold of it and pulling. He aimed his other hand at Saru, who had been moving closer under the veil of the other combatants. Bancho 10 in? The man flew forward, unable to contest Pain's attractive force. He should have crashed into Naruto in midair, but both twisted so that their feet met instead. The chain Pain was holding suddenly grew spikes, forcing him to release it. In that moment, Naruto pushed off his teammate's feet and flew right at Pain, chains already wrapping along his arm. It should have been the deciding blow. It was strike that could crush boulders and rend steel, and Pain's 5-second window had yet to close. In any other situation that blow would have landed, crushing Pain's remaining body and ending the fight. This was not that situation. Kakido. Naruto's eyes widened as the chains around his fist suddenly melted away. Pain caught his wrist and spun, slamming him bodily to the ground next to Teiko. The breath was driven from his lungs and his vision swam for a moment. None of the other paths had been half as strong. Shirado. A third arm burst from Pain's shoulder, shredding the already tattered Akatsuki cloak. The metallic hand caught Nozumi's blade head-on, denting slightly but otherwise holding. She tried to pull away, but Pain's unnatural appendage twisted with dexterity impossible for a normal human, turning a full 360 degrees. A good swordsman knew never to let go of their blade, but a better one knew that no life was worth a weapon. Nozumi jumped back, relinquishing her sword and drawing a Kusarigama from her uniform in a single movement. She was making room for Jiraiya, currently charging into Pain's side with a much larger Rasengan. You do not learn, sensei. A fourth arm emerged from his other shoulder, this one already shifted into a wicked-looking barrel, glowing with power. The sage jinked to the side to avoid the lance of light, but Pain had never been aiming at him. He shot Nozumi's sword instead, splitting the beam into two streaks, one catching the swordswoman in her side, the other catching Teiko on the wrist from where the man had been attempting to sneak up on the Rinnegan user. A flurry of chains rushed him, but they melted uselessly against the spherical corona of the Pretapath that surrounded the man. You doomed yourself when you believed you could face God and survive. By destroying my paths, you have merely consolidated their power, concentrated it into one form. When Saru next moved in close, two of Pain's arms flashed out like whips, grabbing the man's wrists. Saru had only a moment to look shocked, staring into the merciless ripples of the Rinnegan, before another hand stabbed through his stomach. His body lurched, the point of the hand emerging from his back like a macabre spear, and a bit of blood leaked from under his mask. Taicho! Kuma cried out. It was the cry of a child that had seen something truly horrific, scaled out 100 times. The beast of a man was suddenly there, elbows and knees moving in barely perceivable blurs of motion. Pain callously dropped the ANBU captain to fend off the furious assault. Arms moved in equally dizzying displays to slap away the brutal attacks. Naruto had never seen Kuma so enraged, every single strike was aimed to crush, to kill. Still, Pain's body was like a machine. Wherever Kuma aimed, a hand was already there to slap him away. Then Nozumi was there too, the curved blade of her Kusarigama scything through the air to take off one of Pain's arms. One of his hands separated, cable-like threads emerging from the fingers that tangled up the chain weapon, before some kind of motor whirred to life and pulled them all back, forcing Nozumi forward. Kuma's knee came up in a blow that should have removed the Rinnegan user's head, but he brought the chain of the Kusarigama around and caught it. The moment the mountain of a man was immobilized, Pain struck forward with 3 precise, but no less monstrous punches. The crack of his ribs, shoulder, and knee shattering at the same time echoed around the clearing. In the same moment, Pain's remained free hand flipped through seals, pausing on Inu. The Kusarigama he and Nozumi were holding was suddenly infused with electricity, causing the woman to cry out, her back arching painfully. In that second, with her muscles locked and unable to release her grip, he pulled on the chain. Nozumi would have been pulled into his range if not for a futon-infused shuriken slicing right through one of the links, releasing her both from the weapon, and the current flowing through it. Pain rounded on Teiko. The small man had managed to pull Saru away and was just drawing his arm back from its throw. Before the self-proclaimed god could do anything though, Jiraiya was on him. That taijutsu bout was far more balanced. Pain might have had more limbs, but Jiraiya was faster. With whatever strange power he was using, his body seemed to react before his mind even knew what was going on. Besides that, a strange, ghostly presence appeared to follow his fists, landing blows that had been deftly avoided. Pain only tried to absorb the Sanin's chakra once. After his arm nearly turned to stone, he didn't attempt it again. Neither seemed to be gaining the upper hand, but that wasn't the point. Jiraiya's distraction allowed Naruto and Teiko time to pull their comrades out of reach of the fight. Naruto barely finished dragging Kuma over to the makeshift safe spot towards the edge of the field before turning and charging back in. Nezumi, having recovered her sword from where Pain had dropped it to focus on Jiraiya, apparently had the same idea. Pain caught them moving in from the edge of his vision, his features betraying none of his irritation. He waited until Jiraiya was in the middle of taking a step forward. Those invisible punches of his seemed to somehow rely on shifting the weight of his body forward and back, and grew his final pair of arms. They slammed forward, driving open-palmed strikes into Jiraiya's stomach. The sage had apparently been waiting for something like this and grinned, using his increased durability to tank the blow. Pain could already feel the subtle shifts in his chakra as the man prepared to counterattack. Ninjendo? He never got the chance. Pain's arms pulled back, and with them went something unnatural. It was like condensed mist, shifting and contorting even as Pain tried to rip it free. Jiraiya's eyes widened and the man seemed to freeze, his skin turning pale. Still, he fought. Pain had the element of surprise, but a shinobi's tenacity to live was an impressive thing. Aided by Jiraiya's deep connection to nature through his senjutsu, Pain might as well have been trying to uproot a mountain. That one moment of surprise was all he needed though. One of his other arms came up, shifting into a thick, serrated blade mid-motion. Jiraiya had just enough energy to move his body, and for it he only lost an arm, and not his life. The entire field seemed to pause in that instant, everyone staring dumbly as the arm arced lazily through the air, blood spraying out in thick, crimson spurts. The moment passed and everything started moving again. Pain moved another hand forward to correct his mistake, but was forced to drop the sannin and step back or have all of his arms severed by the streak of silvery light Nezumi became. Again, before he could retaliate properly, Naruto interposed himself between them. The blonde moved with nearly the same speed as Jiraiya, lashing out with blows that, to an observer, might look wild and unrefined. Pain knew better though, recognizing that the occasionally wasteful movements were designed to draw the eye from the actual strikes Naruto was aiming at vital points. Far more impressively, the teen was manifesting his chains around his fists only once they had passed within Pain's Preta path. The sheer concentration it must take to conjure physical chakra constructs in a fraction of a second, making them dangerous enough to actually hurt Pain if they landed, was prodigious. It helped that, to his eyes, the boy practically blazed with chakra. He was more than certain that without what must have been around 6 taels worth of the beast's energy, the teen wouldn't be nearly this dangerous. Curiously though, there was no telltale chakra cloak around the boy, even though he could feel Naruto drawing on more of the beast's energy with each passing moment. Indeed, his movements became more aggressive, more animalistic, but he never succumbed to the loss of control characteristic to all Jinchuriki. There was just no way this teen, barely 15 years old, had managed to master the Kyuubi's chakra to such a degree. And yet he continued, only growing faster and more controlled with each passing moment. Pain was so engrossed by the sight he nearly missed Nezumi coming in low. He stepped to the side in time to put Naruto between him and the swordswoman, but the pair surprised him. The moment Naruto realized Nezumi was there his chains whipped out, spearing forward. It was a fatalistic move, both knew that the chains would never penetrate Pain's Preta path, although he was worried slightly by how close they still managed to come, but that wasn't the point. Naruto threw forward enough chains, enough chakra, that the sphere of light that enveloped Pain's body became a white screen blocking his sight. On reflex all 6 of his arms moved out around his body, covering his guard completely. He knew this was a smokescreen designed to give the swordswoman a chance to attack. Unfortunately, he was expecting a sword, so the naginata that suddenly sliced through 2 of the arms on his right caught him by surprise. He shifted, but the weapon had already slipped back out of the opaque corona of chakra. Naruto had been assaulting him for nearly 5 seconds now. The boy's chakra capacity might have been truly terrifying under different circumstances. It abruptly cut out, revealing Nezumi and Naruto standing in front of him, guards up, wary. The Rinnegan user nearly scoffed as he suddenly turned, batting the naginata out of Nezumi's hand and catching her by the throat. To think they would try to fool him with clones, the audacity. An impressive gambit for on-the-fly tactics between 2 people who hadn't spoken, but they were facing no ordinary shinobi. Nezumi didn't claw or struggle in his grip, even as his hand closed with the inevitability of an iceberg. She simply slashed up with her foot, aiming to cripple him with the sword held between her toes. He could already feel Naruto sprinting from behind him, the clone of Nezumi popping due to the damage to the original. The Kyuubi Jinchuriki was too slow though and Pain's hand speared forward without mercy. Nezumi wasn't dead yet though and, with an upwards flick of her neck, she discarded her mask and spat out a single sanban in a smooth motion. It did little but annoy Pain, but the fact that she aimed at his eye was distracting enough that she could shift her body ever so slightly in his grip. Instead of puncturing her heart, his fist drove through her right lung. No less fatal, but it wasn't instantly lethal. A good Anbu never let their death be pointless. She was dropped, callously, as Pain turned to meet the approaching blonde, only for the man to blink as Naruto bypassed him entirely. The Jinchuriki dived forward, catching Nezumi in a tight roll before coming up with her in his arms, eyes scanning her frantically. "No, no, no, not again," he muttered breathlessly, pressing his hand on the deep wound until it was drenched in her blood. For once, the sight provided no comfort, just adding to his growing terror. "Bad protocol," Nezumi intoned weakly, the edges of her lips turning up in a ghost of a smile. She shouldn't even have been able to speak with a lung wound like that, but chakra was a hell of a thing. Naruto knew, of course, she was referring to the fact that ANBU were supposed to disregard casualties while a threat remained unneutralized. Always terrible. Umbu. She smiled again, but Naruto couldn't see beneath the veil of his own hair, shadowing his eyes. "You see, Jinchuriki, the more you resist, the more pain I am forced to inflict. This could have all been avoided if you simply dash." "Shut up," Naruto growled, gently setting Nezumi down on the ground. She was still alive, barely, but wouldn't last long with a wound like that. She was as good as dead though. Tsunade was the only one capable of helping her now, and there was no way they could get her back to the village in time. Yet, he felt no sadness at this thought, just a deep, burning rage unlike anything he had ever felt before. The anger of his past felt petty now. What had he been mad about? Other people ignoring him? A lack of recognition? That was nothing, meaningless in the face of this deep, searing pain that bubbled up from somewhere dark and cold, yet turned to an all-consuming fire inside of him. It would have burned him alive, consuming him from the inside, but he grabbed it, wrestled it into submission. He felt the sieve close. Those elusive strands of the Kyuubi's power flowing through him unabated. The chains that acted like tails retreated, drawing back into his tailbone as wisps of visible chakra began to flake off his body, a deep, unsettling orange. Pain observed all of this calmly, feeling the monstrous surge of chakra within the teen. It looked like the blonde was on fire, tendrils of chakra curling off his body like the hypnotizing ripples of a candle. A chain suddenly ripped out of the blonde's body, it too looking like it was on fire, and Pain's hand came up, his predapath flaring to life. His eyes widened in shock though when he felt the serrated edge of that chain slice through his cheek. More followed, and this time he instinctively called upon his most innate ability. The chain slammed into a wall of force that, thankfully, held, allowing him to skip back and take stock. A hand came up to his cheek tentatively. No blood ran from the corpse's wound, but he could still feel the ragged edge of the cut. That should not have been possible, no chakra should have been able to breach his Gakido. Did the Kyuubi give the construct some unique property? No, impossible. The teen had been drawing on the Biju's power for nearly the entire fight and it hadn't been able to get past his defenses before. Naruto staggered slightly as he moved forward, and Pain realized that the teen must still be acclimatizing to the sudden influx of power. He shot forward, intending to capitalize on the lapse in concentration while he could. All the other combatants of consequence were disabled, it was just him and the Jinchuriki now. If he could end this swiftly, his job would be complete. A chakra rod dropped into his hand as he ran, and to make sure Naruto had no time to recover, he threw a hand forward. Bancho Tenin? The blonde flew forward, but as soon as his feet left the grass, chains shot out of his back and anchored him to the ground. His body hung there, suspended, before his mouth twisted into a vicious grin. Die! More chains ripped from his body, all of them practically aflame with chakra, and rocketed forward with far more speed than Naruto could have given, propelled by Pain's own technique. He cut it off, but it was too late. The chains lurched forward and he instinctively called on his predapath. This time he saw what happened intimately. Chakra was absorbed from the chains, or at least, the flaming layer coating them. He suddenly realized what exactly that was: excess energy. The chains were too dense, so packed with chakra that they were visibly leaking. His Gakido couldn't keep up. He stole power from the technique, but the remaining physical construct still got through with enough force to damage him. He scowled as one of his extra arms was shorn clean off by a serrated chain, but continued his charge. If he could stab the Jinchuriki, it wouldn't matter how potent his techniques were, he would lose control of his chakra. He hadn't been paying enough attention to where Naruto had positioned himself. A chain shot backwards, curling around the hilt of Nezumi's sword. Pain reached him in time for his rod to be slapped to the side by the unusually sturdy blade. The blonde immediately discarded it, launching himself forward without abandon. He landed on Pain, grabbing fistfuls of the man's already shredded cloak and proceeding to wail on him with chain-enhanced blows. Pain's last remaining Shirado arm tried to pry him off, but Naruto's strength, compounded by the Kyuubi, was monstrous. His eyes pulsed and Naruto was thrown back forcibly, along with everything in a 5-foot radius. A clean crater of compressed earth blossomed under Pain's body as Naruto was sent flying backwards in an uncontrolled spin. Chains flailed around him, grasping and searching for purchase. The moment they touched ground they dug in, bringing the teen to a stop before launching him forward again. He was relentless, fast, and strong, throwing himself at Pain again and again. Wounds the man managed to inflict healed in seconds, barely even noticed by the blonde, but every blow Naruto landed was felt. The Pretapath helped, shunting all the absorbed chakra into healing the puppet body, but there was only so much it could keep up with, and Naruto refused to slow or tire. He was claws and fists and chains, in an unending hail of pain and damage and fury. This wasn't the meticulous precision of an ANBU, but this wasn't the animalistic instinct of a Bijou either. This was primal, but it was controlled. It was furious, but directed, and it was all Pain could do not to get shredded. Shinra Tensei. He forced the blonde back again, pouring more power than usual into the repulsive force. Naruto simply caught himself in the trees, barely phased, but it created distance. He flashed through rapid hand seals before slamming his hand down. Kuchios no Jutsu. He wanted something strong, that could take a berserker like Naruto head-on, but the enormous rhino had barely materialized before chains were snaking around its body. It never got to charge, lifted into the air and thrown at Pain like some monstrous parody of a kunai. He dismissed it before it landed, only to scowl as Naruto burst through the dissipating smoke, those unyielding chains trailing behind him like the fronds of some golden jellyfish. Pain felt out the tentative connection to the Pretapath's body, reanimating the corpse and throwing in Naruto's path. He needed to blunt the charge, absorb the teen's chakra while he was close. Naruto tore the corpse in half and barely seemed to notice. "You try my patience," Pain growled, putting his hands together and focusing intently. Chibaku Tensei. A tiny black sphere floated out of his hands, no bigger than a marble. One of Naruto's chains swatted at it as he soared past, but it passed right through the little ball and the blonde immediately dismissed it as irrelevant. He didn't think so a moment later when he realized he was slowing down, his body coming to hang in a strange, weightless state, before slowly being drawn back. The ground around him began to buckle, first dust and leaves, then small chunks of ground floating upwards towards that little black sphere. He struggled, chains flying forward to dig into the ground, but that only served to rip up the turf, allowing larger chunks of dirt and soil to fly upwards, faster and faster as the growing ball of detritus and rock grew steadily larger. He looked ridiculous, thrashing about like a piece of seaweed caught in a particularly violent current. Then he slammed into the tiny moon and regained his balance, glaring down at the sole figure unaffected by the upended gravity. Pain's eyes already had a look of victory in them. How could they not? This was the very technique the Rikudo Sannin had used to create the moon. How could a Jinchuriki brat hope to escape it? He fought, certainly, using his chains to catch and crush the incoming boulders and stay on the edge of the technique instead of being swallowed within. But soon, the pull of the miniature planetoid's gravity would become too strong. The chains were made of chakra and weren't actually affected by gravity, but his body would become sluggish and heavy and he would be subsumed. Naruto also seemed to realize this, struggling with greater fervor. He tried to use his fire jutsu again, but the scalding flames merely bent backwards, drawn towards the growing mass just like everything else. His chains thrashed at the rock itself, trying to dig through and destroy the black sphere that was holding it all together, but it was much too late. The rock that deep was already compressed to steel-like toughness, he would never reach it in time. Pain was almost surprised when the blonde stopped, simply standing there on the little floating moon and staring down at him, apparently having given up. No, when he looked closer, the flame-like aura around the boy seemed to swell. He was focusing, drawing on more power. Despite the certainty Pain had in his own technique, he felt the stirrings of unease. Naruto held his hand out, chakra beginning to swirl in his palm. Pain immediately recognized it as Jiraiya's technique, but something was off about it. The swirling sphere of chakra was not blue, it was gold. He focused more chakra to his eyes, only for them to widen. It wasn't Jiraiya's technique at all, but some bastardized version of it, comprised entirely of tiny, almost delicate-looking chains that whirred and spun and ground against one another. With the flame-like aura covering the teen, it almost looked like he held a miniature sun in his palm. Pain's wariness only grew. The way Jiraiya had used it, it was a very short-range jutsu. What could the blonde hope to achieve from? He threw it. It was like watching the world in slow motion. Naruto wound back his arm like he was pitching a ball and simply threw the technique at Pain. That should have been impossible. No chakra construct should have been able to sustain itself so far from its creator without a direct connection. It should have destabilized and dissipated. It was only when the little writhing sphere of chains was feet away from the Rinnegan user that he understood. The flames of chakra. The same reason his chains could bypass his Preta path. The chain Rasengan survived as long as the aura around it could dissipate instead of the technique itself. Without the Kyuubi's chakra, something like this would have been impossible. He activated his Predapath, but he already knew it wouldn't be enough. He resigned himself to defeat the moment he saw the last few flickers of the flaming aura fade away. In that moment, the sphere unfurled like a bomb, catapulting chains out at incomparable speeds. Everything was struck, the ground, the trees, pain, but the technique kept going. The spin continued, reversing, drawing the chains, and everything they had speared into, back. Pain collided with 100 clumps of rock and earth and would in some strange parody of his own Chibaku Tensei, his body crushed by the conflicting debris. That was where the similarities ended though. This technique wasn't immune to gravity, and a moment later it, and Yahiko's body, fell. In the distance, he could feel his own technique falling apart. Tendo had been damaged enough that he could no longer sustain it. It was humiliating, being forced to lie there in a broken body, too much like his true situation. But he could feel Naruto approaching, and wasn't willing to accept that he had been defeated. The moment he spotted the blonde though, he knew this was it. Naruto no longer glowed with the Kyuubi's chakra, but his eyes burned with something far more intent. Any sneak attack, any trick Pain could have pulled in his weakened state, it would have failed. "You're just a feral beast," he spat, giving up the pretense of his lofty condescension. He wasn't expecting Naruto to smile. It was a strange, wistful sort of look, tainted by the hatred in his eyes. "Beast," he said. "Maybe. I kill people, and sometimes I enjoy it. Somebody a lot wiser than I am told me that being a shinobi is a job like any other, we just kill people instead. But I know the truth, and Beast is pretty accurate." Pain was surprised by the sheer vitriol that entered the teen's expression. "But feral?" Naruto scoffed. "All your visual prowess, and you can't even see them? All of these chains tying me down." He ran his fingers around his neck, like a convict stroking his noose. "The Hokage holds this one, knowing he can tighten it whenever he wants." He glanced down, shaking a foot like was bound by heavy manacles. "Those anchor me to Konoha, making sure I'll never be able to live anywhere else." He looked down at his wrists, caressing something finer, subtler, like a puppet's strings. "These connect me to my sensei." Finally, his hand reached up to almost tentatively touch his heart, but Pain saw no more as a chain suddenly lashed forward, severing his spine without warning. "This one annoys me the most, because I didn't even see it being tied." Chapter 29, 29th Link. Naruto stared down at Pain's broken body dispassionately. Evidence of the Azura path had retreated, leaving an ordinary corpse lying in the rubble of his technique. Ordinary, except for the piercings he had used to give himself the countenance of a god. Naruto scoffed at that. If it wasn't a hallucination, then he had met a real god. Pain couldn't begin to compare to the sheer otherworldliness of Jashin. He could still feel the subtle burn of her symbol keeping the will of the Kyuubi at bay. Pain certainly didn't look godly now, half naked, with a leg missing and his other limbs twisted and broken. "Good work, kid," Jiraiya grunted as he carefully made his way over the loose earth and rocks, patting the blonde on the shoulder. He was still using that weird technique, and Naruto expected it was the only thing keeping the older man going. Even now he wore a grim face, clutching at the stump of his left arm. He also appeared to be rubbing something brown and gloopy into the wound. Naruto didn't care to ask. "Need a hand?" he asked, surprising himself with the flippant question. He suddenly felt detached from the whole situation, like it had been somebody else fighting and he was just an observer. He felt colder now, without the burn of the Kyuubi's chakra rushing through his body, emptier. "Har har," the Sannin groused, staring down at Pain's body with a strange expression. The two toads on his shoulders, something else Naruto didn't want to ask about, remained quiet, sharing in the man's pensive mood. Naruto turned his attention back to the body, but that was all it was to him, a corpse. His eyes widened slightly and he turned, but Jiraiya caught his arm, holding him in place. "She's fine, you can go see her later." When Naruto glared at him, the man finally tore his attention away from his former student. "Yes, that wound is lethal, but I've made arrangements to get her and the rest of your ANBU friends back to Konoha." He motioned, and Naruto spotted the group in the distance. Nozumi had been delivered to the rest of the team and they were currently in the process of being swallowed by a large toad. Normally, her wounds would be fatal. So would Saru's. Luckily for them, toads are awesome in all sorts of ways. The elderly toads on his shoulders seemed to preen, and Jiraiya moved his hand with a wince, showing the sticky substance on his fingers. Toad oil has light restorative properties, not enough to save them, but enough at least to get them back to the village. Naruto's face betrayed his relief, but a moment later tightened back to a scowl. "Then I'm going with them?" Jiraiya let out a long sigh. "Of all the times for you to get sentimental." "No, we're not done here yet." He stood there a moment, only to grimace in irritation. Still not used to having one hand. "I really hope there's something Tsunade can do about that." He motioned with his good arm to Pain's body. This, and the others, were just puppets. We still need to go confront the real threat. In our condition? Naruto wasn't outwardly hurt, the Kyuubi's chakra made sure of that, but he wasn't exactly fresh. That much power coursing through his body left a toll, and he was quickly approaching his threshold for exhaustion. I'm not thrilled about it either, Jiraiya muttered. If you hadn't noticed, I'm not exactly as handy as I once was. He sighed. But it's better than letting Nagato regain his strength and do all of this again. Naruto glanced around at the destruction and grimaced. The field had been completely destroyed, first by the Chibaku Tensei ripping up the ground, and then again by the resulting planetoid crashing back to Earth. They got lucky with the arrival of his squad. He wasn't so certain that he and Jiraiya alone could have defeated Pain. Fine, he grumbled. You have a way of finding him then? He couldn't imagine the man sticking around after such a defeat, if this even was a defeat. For all he knew, somebody of equal power to Pain's last body was waiting for them. I think so. Jiraiya stooped down and ripped one of the piercings from Pain's arm, curling his fingers about it and focusing intently. You're going to have to tell me about? The motion to Jiraiya's altered appearance, this, at some point. Sorry boyo, the grandfatherly-looking toad quipped with a defiant grin. MT Miyaboku's secret. Toad summoners only. Naruto glared at him, but didn't get a chance to answer before Jiraiya's eyes snapped open, settling into a determined expression. This way. The two quickly moved north from the field and Naruto only stopped at the very edge, sparing a last glance back at his squad. He caught Teiko, the least injured of the quartet, helping to lower Nezumi into the toad's mouth. The short man glanced back around and caught Naruto staring, waving at the boy to go, and the blonde felt a little of the weight in his chest relax. A moment later the toad vanished in a burst of smoke and Naruto hurried to catch up to Jiraiya. Strangely, it wasn't all that hard to find where this Nagato was hiding. A large tree made entirely of what looked like camouflaged sheets of paper. Naruto knew it must have been a jutsu of some kind, because it would be impossible to build by normal means. It stood out when one knew what to look for, but he had to admit that, in passing, he wouldn't likely notice anything different from the surrounding foliage. As they approached, a section of the tree parted like tent flaps to reveal it was entirely hollow. Jiraiya didn't seem to think any of this was strange, despite the fact that Naruto had never once heard of paper ninjutsu, and walked in with confidence. It was dark inside, but a few select cracks in the paper facade allowed through enough sun to provide dim lighting. Naruto thought that was probably for the best as he caught sight of the sickly, emaciated man propped up in a strange machine. He leaned forward on twig-like arms, plunged into large cylinders that must have controlled the crab-like device that he rested in. Even in the gloom, the blonde could see the man's skin was papery and semi-translucent, unhealthily pale. He seemed entirely washed out, with lank, lusterless red hair that drooped over a skeletal face. The most disturbing thing, aside from his extremely prominent ribcage, were the enormous number of black rods emerging from his back, like some twisted parody of a porcupine. If it weren't for the dull Rinnegan peering out from sunken eye sockets, Naruto would have never believed this was the same man he had fought a few minutes before. Nagato, Jiraiya said, warily glancing around the space. Sensei, the emaciated figure replied, his voice a croaky whisper. Naruto got the feeling he had been using Pain as a mouthpiece for a long time now and was unused to speaking with his true voice. What happened to you? Jiraiya asked after a long silence. Life, Sensei, a new voice answered. A woman. She seemed to flutter into existence from 100 different sheets of paper that peeled off the walls. Naruto hadn't even sensed her and was suddenly wary for whatever else she might have planted around to the room. Far from her companion, this woman seemed in perfect health, floating off the ground on large papery wings formed to look like an angel's. Conan, Jiraiya greeted with a sad smile, you've grown into quite the beauty. Naruto didn't have a good sense for these things, but he could see where Jiraiya was coming from. He figured Conan would be considered quite exotic, with her blue hair and vibrant orange eyes. However, the cold look in those eyes and her generally guarded demeanor transformed it into a stern, unapproachable sort of beauty. And you are as incorrigible as ever, she replied neutrally. Naruto was surprised at even that much cordiality, considering what had just happened. I'm glad you continued with your origami. You can't imagine how sad I was to think such a beautiful ability had been stolen from the world when I heard you three had died. An inappropriate time for flattery, don't you think, Sensei? She said. Jiraiya's tired smile grew a little. Never. I'm surprised you came, Jiraiya, Nagato interrupted, doing away with the sentimentality and staring at the older man intently. You should know that tired and wounded as you are, your victory is far from assured. Naruto scowled, chains beginning to creep from his back to hover over his shoulders expectantly. Likewise, Konan floated a little higher, the very edges of her wings shifting into sharpened edges. This tense standoff only lasted a few seconds before Jiraiya rested his good hand on Naruto's shoulder, reining the teen in. Similarly, Nagato inclined his head and Konan relaxed. "I don't think threats are going to get anybody anything here," Jiraiya said. "Which raises the question of just what you expected to happen," Nagato replied. "You couldn't have assumed that we would stand aside out of pure sentimentality. Regardless of the destruction of my paths, the Akatsuki's goal has not changed." "And what goal is that?" Jiraiya demanded, the first hint of anger rising in his tone. "What could you possibly want with the Jinchuriki?" "The same as you," came the quiet reply. "The same dream you shared with 3 hungry orphans. The same dream Yahiko stoked and kept alive while we fought for our country. Peace. That is what the Akatsuki, in all of its forms, has always fought for." Jiraiya was actually stunned, recovering a moment later with a sad shake of his head. "Peace? You have to be insane to think that you could ever achieve peace with violence." Konan shifted, her lips twitching down into the shadow of a scowl, and she glanced to Nagato. The skeletal man narrowed his eyes. "And you have to be a fool to think that anything worth having, especially peace, can be achieved without sacrifice, without pain? So that's what this was all about? The act, the moniker, pretending to be a god? You believe you can simply cow people into peace? That's tyranny, Nagato. I taught you better than that." "I thought you knew better than that." Nagato was quiet for a moment, appearing thoughtful. "You are older than us, Jiraiya. Do you remember the aftermath of the Second Shinobi War?" If Jiraiya was thrown by the tangent, he didn't show it, he simply nodded. "I know you want me to say that there was peace, that peace always follows times of great tragedy. But that's a child's view of the world, Nagato. That wasn't peace, that was simply the waiting period for the next war, while the world powers recovered their strength to revenge themselves of old grievances. Does that matter to normal people?" Nagato responded. "Does the farmer care if tensions are growing between shinobi villages? He only knows that right now, there is peace, and he can grow enough food to provide for his family. I agree that the wars are an inelegant thing though, they leave ruin in their wake. Poverty, homelessness, orphans. And your answer is? A weapon," Nagato whispered, a dangerous sort of fervor in his eyes that seemed to revitalize the emaciated man. "A weapon of such terrible destruction that it would end any war instantly for fear of its use. A weapon created from the combined power of the Bijou," Jiraiya said with grim realization. "And you think that you, or any one man, should possess that kind of power? What about when you die? Who is there to prevent this weapon being used? Who said anything about preventing its use?" Nagato replied. "Human memory is too fleeting. Greed, corruption, avarice, these things are inevitable, growing within societies like a tumor. I would see my weapon used, a constant reminder of what awaits anyone who would cause suffering and war. And when humans forget, return to their nature, the weapon will be used again. A true cycle of suffering and peace. So that's it?" Jiraiya said, suppressing his horror. "You would sacrifice hundreds, for a fleeting peace you already know wouldn't last? Better than the thousands that inevitably die when the shinobi war amongst themselves. Better a clean, instant death, than the slow rot of extended battle, draining entire nations dry. The world will have peace, at the lowest cost achievable." "There shouldn't be a cost for peace," Jiraiya argued back. "It should be a shared understanding. A transcension above the petty cycles of revenge begetting revenge." Nagato tore one of his arms out of the machine with a wet squelch, slamming it back down with a snarl. "There is always a cost. Yahiko already paid it, and I intend to see that his sacrifice wasn't for nothing." He calmed himself, placing his hand back into the machine and resetting his features. "You're just the idealist you ever were, sensei. I had thought that you of all people, might have understood what I am trying to do here. Real, achievable peace. Just because something is doable, doesn't mean it should be done. And I'm sure your trite turns of phrase would have been very comfortable while we planned the downfall of a corrupt regime," Nagato retorted. "We can't always be the protagonist of an adventure story, battling the villain and solving all the world's problems in a single climactic fight. We live in the real world, Jiraiya-sensei. And what a shame that is, right?" A new player spoke up as Toby walked out of the shadows, acting like he had been there all along. "Madara?" Konan half-greeted, half-rebuked in her cold tone. "Madara?" Naruto asked, more to himself than anyone else. Toby caught it all the same, looking his way. He had traded out his swirling orange mask for a smooth white one that was more like a helmet. This one was patterned with concentric circles not dissimilar from the Rinnegan, except with Magatama cut out for eye holes. He had also discarded his Akatsuki cloak, wearing a light purple battle kimono tied with a white obi that looked almost ceremonial. Still, despite the overhaul of his appearance, that relaxed posture and mocking tone was undoubtedly Toby. Oh, did I tell an itty-bitty lie when I told you my name was Toby? How dreadfully rude of me. When his lazy gaze turned to Naruto, the blonde was surprised to see two Sharingan peering out of the darkened eye holes. That should have been possible, of course, unless this man was secretly Itachi Uchiha, but then why the pretense? No, Naruto had heard a lot about the wayward Uchiha scion in ANBU, and couldn't reconcile the two. It would make sense if this really was Madara Uchiha, but the legendary founder would have to be nearly 100 years old. What are you doing here, Madara? Nagato croaked warningly. What am I doing here? The whimsical man replied. I'm distracting you all, obviously. There was a moment's confusion, then Nagato cried out. Something was crawling over his body, something black, like a shadow with substance. It quickly overtook his body, covering up the entire right side of his body. The Rinnegan eye was replaced by a solid yellow orb that stared unblinkingly at the assembled crowd. No mouth appeared, but a voice emerged from the ink-like creature all the same. That's better. It's been some time since I had to take a body forcibly. His tone was low and sibilant, the kind that immediately put listeners on edge. Zetsu, Konan hissed, looking torn between helping Nagato and attacking Toby. She didn't dare move out of fear of what the shadowy creature might do. What's the meaning of this? Quite simple, Toby, or Madara, answered in the thing's place. Our dear Nagato took out a loan a long time ago. I'm merely here to collect. What are you talking about? Nagato wheezed. It looked like it took a great deal of effort to say even that much. Naruto suspected he wasn't the only one exhausted after their recent bout. Those eyes in your skull? Toby answered. Did you really think some no-name orphan in the back end of Aim no Kuni would develop such a legendary jujitsu? He waved his arms dramatically, but carried on without waiting for an answer. Of course not, only Madara Uchiha has the visual prowess to develop such powerful eyes. You, my wonderful little puppet, have just been keeping them warm for me. His tone abruptly darkened, becoming dangerous. And now I want them back? He didn't even move as a barrage of razor-sharp paper shuriken flooded his body, passing through harmlessly. The masked man glanced around to where Konan was floating, glaring both literal and figurative daggers at him. Ah, Konan, as adorable as ever. I think we both know how this particular song and dance goes, don't we? Do we? Naruto cut in with a vicious grin. He had been mostly content to stay quiet through the philosophizing, quite bored actually, in order to regain his energy. Now that there was promise of fighting, and with somebody he was already intrigued by, he couldn't suppress his anticipation. The glance Toby sent at the blonde was warier, but his tone still held that playful edge that was so disconcerting. Ah, Naruto-kun, I'm afraid you'll have to wait a little while before I deal with you. Important things are happening, backs are being stabbed and such. You know how it is? I won't let you hurt him, Konan spat, practically vibrating in the air as she deliberated on what to do. She clearly couldn't harm Toby in a meaningful way, and she still didn't know what Zetsu wanted. Harm him. The man parroted bemusedly. Dear, I'm not going to touch a hair on his emaciated little head. Konan only had a brief chance to look confused before Nagato suddenly pulled his hands free of his walking contraption, looking as though he was struggling against himself as he did so. Slowly, agonizingly so, he began forming a chain of hand seals that even Jiraiya didn't recognize. Stop, he grunted, arms shaking as he fought Zetsu's manipulation. Part of the creature's face split apart, parodying a victorious grin. I'm afraid you have one last role to play, Nagato-kun, one that your entire life has been leading towards. The hand seals continued and everyone in the room could feel the enormous pressure mounting behind the technique. Jiraiya tensed and prepared to do something, but he was too late. When Zetsu spoke, it was with Nagato's voice, literally forcing the Rinnegan user's mouth into position. Geto. Rinne. Tensei, no dash. Nagato's gasp was almost as relieved as it was pained, a sword suddenly spearing through his chest from behind. Zetsu's scream was more furious than anything as the technique was cut off, the chakra dissipating harmlessly. The scream seemed to echo strangely as the ink-black creature began swirling in place, vanishing into a vortex, similar to the manner Toby had escaped the first time. Sure enough, Toby stood atop the back of Nagato's machine, wiping his hands against his robe and leaving the sword embedded in the sickly man's chest. None of that now. I may be nihilistic, but I'm not stupid. Bringing him back wouldn't be to anybody's advantage. He paused, placing a finger to the mask thoughtfully. Saying that, it's actually just not to my advantage. But that's the only one that matters. Nagato. Konan cried, finally overcoming her shock to send another furious onslaught of shuriken at Toby. The man skipped away, but made a great show of how the paper constructs still only passed through his body. The blue-haired woman flew to her friend's side, but the damage was done. Nagato was slumped forward in his machine, blood leaking slowly down the blade emerging from his heart. Naruto enhanced his hearing with a subtle application of the Kyuubi's chakra, enough to hear Nagato whisper something to Konan, but not enough to quite make out what. His breaths ran out a moment later, and Pain died. Well, that solves problem number 2. Toby exclaimed brightly, clapping his hands together and generally seeming quite pleased with himself. Konan's head shot around at the proclamation, tears streaming down her cheeks but a fire in her eyes. I'll kill you, you bastard. Toby clicked his tongue. Well, that wasn't very angelic at all. What would the good people of AIM say if they saw their Tenchi-sama now? He did one of those irritating pauses again before chuckling. They might not even notice, I suppose. Dead gods are a once-in-a-lifetime sight after all. Konan's eyes narrowed to slits, her wings spreading out to their full length as she raised a hand. You'll burn for this, Madara. The fake tree they were in began to quiver and rustle, appearing to come apart at the very seams. It quickly became obvious though, as they began to melt of color one by one, that the entire structure was almost completely comprised of exploding tags. Naruto's was begrudgingly impressed by the sight. The tree was enormous, he couldn't even count how many explosive tags that meant. Enough to level a large town maybe? And this woman controlled them all. He wasn't sure how that would kill a man who seemed to phase through most attacks, but his chains had done damage, so maybe explosions could too. He never got to find out, as a moment later her eyes widened in shock and she fell out of the air, unconscious. Jiraiya caught her before she could hit the floor and gently laid her to one side. The tree stopped moving and, remarkably, didn't immediately fall apart. Well, that was anticlimactic, Toby muttered churlishly, kicking a random section of ground. Have you always been such a fun killer, Jiraiya, or is that a recent thing? The sage gave the masked man an even look. Maybe I just don't like seeing pretty ladies lured into traps. Ah well, Toby responded sheepishly, revealing the ornate gunbai he had been hiding behind his back. I guess I can't rely on emotional manipulation to get everybody, eh? Naruto didn't know the significance of the traditional battle fan, but Jiraiya was eyeing it warily enough that he knew to take it seriously. I don't know where you got that weapon from, but you're no Madara Uchiha. Toby raised his hands in faux frustration. Again, I just can't seem to slip one by you, eh? You know, you're one of the first people to actually be skeptical of my claim? I know, surprised me too. I guess shinobi are as superstitious as they are idiotic. Still, I didn't expect you to be quite so handy with your deductions. Who are you? Jiraiya demanded. The man's head cocked to the side. Seriously, nothing? I thought that was a pretty good pun. But I'll hand it to you, it may have been in poor taste. I won't ask again, Jiraiya reiterated, tensing. Naruto followed suit. After a terse few seconds Toby shrugged, straightening his posture and ditching the whimsical tone. He suddenly cast a very different image, serious, powerful. Not somebody to be taken lightly. Does it matter, really? He almost sounded weary. It does when somebody is running around with a pair of Sharingan, pretending to be Madara Uchiha and manipulating the likes of the Akatsuki. Toby waved airily. I'm nobody. A memory, at most. Not good enough. Toby shrugged again, this one coming off a lot less flippant. You'll understand soon. Everyone will. Jiraiya boy, one of the toads on the sage's shoulders suddenly cried out, too late. An enormous root suddenly burst from the ground, growing in a blink to slam Jiraiya bodily in the stomach. It wasn't enough to hurt the man, but it was strong enough to launch him right through the wall of the paper tree. Naruto blinked at the sudden intrusion of daylight into the previously dim interior, and in that split second Toby had crossed the distance between them, reaching out to grab his arm. He pulled back, but Toby was fast, able to catch his wrist in an iron grip. The moment he did, Naruto felt a strange tugging sensation, as if his entire body was being wrung out. His hand warped, twisting in on itself like Zetsu had and, by panic or reflex, he released as many chains from his body as he could. Toby hissed in pain as one scored his arm, releasing the blonde. Naruto stopped distorting and lurched back into reality. It had been a while since he had gone full hedgehog like that. Those damn chains again, Toby muttered as he swept back, palming the warfan again. Naruto drew on the Kyuubi's chakra, feeling that familiar warmth swell up inside him. He knew he wouldn't be able to hold it for long, he was already risking exhaustion. Shaking his head to clear it of the last few dregs of confusion, he sprinted forward, determined to make it count. He had just dragged himself through too much to die to this clown. Toby appeared to have made a similar resolution as he moved forward, flashing through and seals. Katan, Hosenka no Jutsu. 100 white-hot balls of flame filled the air front of the blonde. He simply formed a guard of chains in front of him and dived right through the inferno, ignoring how the shuriken hidden inside the technique embedded in his flesh. They were pushed out and the wounds began to heal before he even landed. Those same chains lashed forward while he was still blinded by the fire, seeking flesh. Most scraped against the ground, carving long rents out of the earth. A few met their mark though, impacting the old gun by. Naruto had been prepared for the antique to hold up against the onslaught. He hadn't been expecting his chains to melt into the war fan, making the old weapon hum with restrained energy. Before he could react, Toby swung the weapon forward, releasing all the pent-up chakra in a single, catastrophic burst. It was only when the smoke cleared that the trench his body had made through the ground became visible. Much of the paper wall behind him was gone, burned away by the intense blast, leaving him in a little cone of sunlight. He could distantly make out the sounds of Jiraiya fighting through the ringing in his ears, but ignored it when Toby approached. Didn't anyone ever tell you not to jump through strange techniques? Guess even ANBU couldn't beat the berserker out of you. Naruto simply grinned from where he lay, propped up by the mound of soil he had displaced. You'd be surprised. He abruptly burst into smoke, causing Toby to do a 180, gun by raised. Naruto wasn't behind him though. Toby was thrown from his feet as the blonde burst out of the ground beneath him, chains snaking after him. He tried to swat them away with the fan, but Naruto knew better now. The chains twisted and contorted in the air, never spearing forward to get caught on the strange weapon's side, but coiling around it. He couldn't pull it from the masked man's hands, it was attached by a cable up the man's sleeve, like Hayden's weapon. Still, the chains continued up, coiling around fingers, hands, arms. They tightened and Toby cried out, dropping to the ground as his arms were crushed mercilessly. The fan fell out of limp fingers as the man dropped to his knees, staring at his own mangled arms in horror. In a different life, in a different time, Naruto might have stood there, enjoying the moment his opponent realized they were defeated. He wasn't in the mood. A single chain snapped forward, spearing through the man's heart and, a moment later, the would-be Madara slumped forward, lifeless. Except something was wrong. Something about this scene just didn't feel right. After everything he had been through that day, such a clean victory felt too easy. It was nothing concrete, just a niggle in the back of his mind that something was off. An itch on his stomach, the mark Jashin had left on his skin. It felt as though it was demanding his attention, trying to tell him something. Chains lanced out of his back without warning, and sure enough he heard the telltale impact of metal through flesh. Something shattered, and so did the world. The genjutsu faded and Naruto turned, observing Toby's impaled body with a far keener eye. A chain came up to scratch his arm, but nothing changed, this was real. One of his chains must have glanced off the man's mask. It now lay in little white shards on the ground. It revealed a fairly average face, scarred heavily on the right side and twisted in surprise. The two Sharingan seemed to spin impotently. Toby tried to speak, but all that came out was a dribble of blood. Curiously, his right arm appeared to lose cohesion, sloughing off his body into a wet puddle of too white flesh. "What the hell are you?" Naruto asked with morbid curiosity. Toby only struggled for a few moments, his body too secured by chains to make much of it. "Izie, nah." He never got the chance to finish as a final, definitive chain speared through his throat, severing his spine and killing him instantly. Naruto really didn't like last-minute reversals. Jiraiya came back in a minute later, dragging something that looked vaguely like a person, but like Toby's arm was too white to be natural. Where it bled, little shrubs erupted from the ground. "This day just keeps getting weirder and weirder," he sighed, sounding every bit as tired as Naruto felt. "What was yours?" Naruto asked, staring down at Toby's corpse quizzically. It felt like at any moment he would spring back to life, or all of this would be some elaborate genjutsu. "Artificial plant person, you?" The blonde shrugged and gestured to Toby. "No idea. Recognize him?" Jiraiya examined the body for a moment and Naruto quite clearly saw the spark of recognition flash in his beady toad-like eyes. Naruto didn't call him on it. After everything that had happened, he found it difficult to care. "Are we done here then?" Jiraiya took a lingering look around the interior of the paper tree, making sure to heft Conan up into his good shoulder before nodding. "Yeah, I think for now at least, we're done." Naruto stretched and let out a long, tension-filled breath. "Finally. Let's go home, your stupid border mission will have to wait." He quickly turned and stalked off, keen to put all of this behind him. He didn't notice how Jiraiya's gaze lingered on him for a few seconds. It was the first time he had heard Naruto call Konoha his home. Chapter 30, Last Link. Aim no Kuni's name was well deserved. The rain fell in heavy sheets, and from what he had heard it was nearly constant. It couldn't be, of course, it would be impossible to grow food if it rained every day of the year, but apparently it rained enough. Naruto let it soak over him, circulating his chakra to keep him warm. "I didn't think funerals were your kind of affair," Haku said. She had been smart enough to bring an umbrella, although he was certain she wouldn't have minded the rain either. Cold really didn't bother a Hayaton user. "They're not. I think they're pointless wastes of time," he muttered back. All the same, he kept his voice low enough that Konan and Jiraiya couldn't hear. He couldn't explain it, but it felt wrong to make such disparaging remarks surrounded by such a solemn atmosphere. But they gave me a good fight, and Jiraiya insisted I be here. He couldn't see why. Toby might have been the one to kill Nagato, but without the destruction of his paths, he wouldn't have been nearly as vulnerable. Still, Konan hadn't objected to his presence, so here he was, in the back end of Aim no Kuni, standing outside of some random cave system. It must have had some significance to Nagato and Yahiko, but nobody had deigned to tell him what that was. The graves were simple, dug into the hard rock with Doton ninjutsu and ornamented only with a small pile of stones. On one, Jiraiya had inscribed a simple design resembling the Rinnegan, on the other he engraved the symbol of Amigakure, scored through like a missing Nin's headband. Konan had proceeded to place a paper flower on each grave and each said some words. Naruto had stayed at a distance, feeling profoundly out of place. He was thankful he'd had the foresight to bring Haku along with him. With her here, he didn't feel quite so awkward. He was confused by the lack of animosity between Konan and them. They had effectively killed her last friend, but she was treating Jiraiya as an old mentor again. She was technically the leader of Amigakure now, which was likely the reason she wasn't in Konoha's custody. Apparently the Sandaime had thought the potential instability in a region as strategically valuable as Aim costlier than allowing a leader of the Akatsuki free. As much weight as that title had anymore. Konan had confirmed it herself, the members of the mercenary group had disbanded almost as soon as they realized Pain was dead. It was a mixed blessing. As a group, they were more organized and potentially more dangerous, but also easier to keep an eye on. As rogue agents, they were less effective in what they could do, but more spread out and difficult to track. Konan had provided a list, but it was of little use now. Still, like a wolf that had caught the scent of prey, Naruto felt anxious. He had, admittedly, been feeling somewhat indecisive over what to do with himself. Before, his goals had seemed so vague. Become strong. Make people recognize him. The fight with Pain had thrown those into sharper focus and he now found them lacking. The threat of the Akatsuki on the horizon had been a good distraction. With them gone, it was once again up to him to decide how to proceed. Thanks to that list, he now knew exactly what he wanted to do. The thought of all those S-class fights was intoxicating. Are you going to say anything? Haku whispered, bringing him out of his thoughts and making him realize that Jiraiya and Konan had moved to the side, talking between themselves. And say what? They're dead. Haku shrugged, moving slowly up to the two nondescript graves. They seemed oddly unremarkable considering who lay in them. A man with legendary eyes, although the Rinnegan had been destroyed by Konan, to make sure nobody else abused their power, and a revolutionary. You came, didn't you? That must mean something? Like I said, Jiraiya made me. He was brought up short by the soft smile she gave him. We both know that isn't true. He looked at her a moment before clicking his tongue. I let you get away with too much nowadays. She surprised him by folding her hands demurely, lowering her head. She still couldn't completely suppress the small smirk she wore. You'll have to punish me later, Naruto-sama. He almost laughed, only stopped by the otherwise somber atmosphere. You seem different. Haku shrugged, standing up straight again. I've had a lot of time to think recently, about my place in life, about what I want to do with myself. That sounded eerily reminiscent of his own thoughts as of late. And, she just smiled at him impishly. He let out a long sigh before nodding slowly. Fine, let's try this out, however pointless it is. He moved over to the two graves, bypassing Yahiko entirely. He may have fought the man's corpse, but he didn't know him at all. Instead, he stood at the foot of Nagato's, struggling for a moment over what to say. I didn't know you. He trailed off, feeling incredibly foolish all of a sudden. He sent a pleading look Haku's way, but the girl was looking over at Jiraiya, probably wondering about the man's arm. Tsunade hadn't been able to reattach his original limb, but had instead fashioned him a replacement from the same white goop that had comprised Tobi's. He was sure that to a medic in training like Haku, and now he was just wasting time. He let out another pained sigh. This seems ridiculous. But, you were a good fight. You might have been trying to kidnap me so you could make some super weapon, or whatever, but you clearly thought what you were doing was right. To be honest, I think peace sounds boring, but then, I guess you did call me a feral beast, so you might have been right on that front. I suppose what I mean is, I have no idea what I mean. He sighed, and Haku appeared at his side again, looking at him expectantly. Feel any different? No, he groused. It was just as pointless as I thought. Just a corpse in a ground, and me talking to myself. The girl shrugged carelessly. Maybe it's not for everyone. What did you say? Me? Nothing. I didn't know either of them. The blonde rounded on her, only to catch her giving him that impish smile again, and he deflated. You did that on purpose? Should I expect a much harsher punishment then? Damn right, he growled, which only seemed to make her even smugger, much to his ire. Jiraiya chose that moment to walk over. Unsurprisingly, Konan didn't join him. Naruto got the feeling she only barely tolerated his presence here as it was. I think we're about ready to wrap up here. Konan needs to get back to her people, and we need to report back to the old man. We've got a lot of reports to fill out. Both Sage and Jinchuriki shivered at that. What'll happen to Amigakure? Haku inquired, genuinely curious. From what you've told me, they look to Pain as a god. I can't imagine it will be an easy transition. Jiraiya shrugged. Apparently Nagato didn't make that many personal appearances, and for a while at least Konan should be able to imitate him with her paper clones. She'll have plenty of time to figure it out. He smiled fondly as he turned to watch the woman grow wings and fly away, quickly disappearing into the heavy rain. She's a smart girl, and I've said I'll come by every so often to see how she's doing. She seems to have accepted you rather easily after everything that happened, Naruto pointed out as they themselves set out into the rain. Konan was always a reserved little girl. I can't imagine all of this ever sat right with her. I genuinely think she'll make a good leader for her village. You didn't really answer the question. He only received a belligerent grin as a response. And you still have told me what was up with that weird-ass transformation you pulled back then? Didn't you hear Fukakasu? Toad summoners only. Unless you've finally accepted the brilliance that is me and decided to let me take you on as an apprentice. Nice try, but I prefer learning useful techniques, not the best way to spy on women in an onsen. Ah, my young pupil, you would be surprised by the overlap between the two. Besides, I'm sure I could come up with some especially creative applications for your chains. Your young lady friend will love it, I can guarantee. Pervert. Brat. Cripple. Dungeon master. Haku watched them bicker a few steps behind, smiling fondly. It became more apparent to her the more she saw, that shinobi were all inherently broken people. But the more they were packed together, the better chance they had of holding each other up. She was glad that Naruto had found so many people to fill in his jagged edges, and she in turn was glad to have found him. Haku, get over here. I'll hold him down, you freeze his hands off. The old hag was too generous in giving him the opportunity to keep writing that garbage. The girl smiled brightly as she hurried to catch up. It was an unorthodox relationship, but right now she couldn't imagine it any other way.